Hi everyone, welcome to Ricktopus. I hope you're all doing well. Today, I want to argue that the Evil Morty theory, one of the most popular in Rick and Morty history, was deliberately designed to mislead us. For years, fans believed Evil Morty was Rick C137's original grandson, abandoned and seeking revenge. The evidence seemed perfect. Impossible photos of baby Morty, timeline contradictions, Rick's unusual attachment, Evil Morty's genius intelligence and obsession with Rick C137 specifically. But when the show finally revealed the truth in seasons 5 and 7, it did something far more disturbing than just proving us wrong. It showed us that Evil Morty didn't need a dramatic origin story to become what he is. He just needed to experience what every Morty experiences and refuse to accept it. And that revelation is infinitely darker than any theory we could have imagined. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. The timeline that doesn't add up. Right from the very first episode of Rick and Morty, the show gives us a simple setup. Rick Sanchez is a genius scientist who disappeared from his daughter Beth's life for a really long time. Then one day, completely out of nowhere, he shows up at her doorstep asking to move in. Beth lets him stay, and Rick immediately starts dragging his grandson Morty on dangerous adventures across different universes. It seems straightforward enough. An absent grandfather returns after years away and tries to reconnect with his family, even if his methods are completely insane and often illegal. But here's where things get weird. The show tells us that Rick was gone for 20 years. 20 full years where he had zero contact with his family. During this entire time, Beth raised her kids without him. She married Jerry, had Summer, then had Morty, and Rick wasn't around for any of it. The official description of the show even says Rick was missing for nearly 20 years before suddenly arriving at Beth's house. This isn't some fan theory or guess. The show directly states this as fact multiple times. Now let's talk about Morty. Throughout the series, we're told that Morty is 14 years old. He says it himself in the episode Anatomy Park, and the show treats him as a freshman in high school. 14 years old. That's important. Keep that number in your head because the math is about to stop making sense. If Rick was gone for 20 years and Morty is currently 14 years old, then Rick left before Morty was even born. Actually, Rick left 6 years before Morty was born if you do the simple math. Rick disappeared when Beth was younger, long before she got pregnant with Morty. This means Rick should have absolutely no memories of Morty as a baby. He wasn't there. He was gone. He missed Morty's entire childhood because he was off doing whatever Rick does when he abandons his family. But the show doesn't follow its own math. In the episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, Rick gets captured by an evil version of himself. This evil Rick hooks Rick up to a machine that scans through all of Rick's memories looking for specific information. While this memory scan is happening, we the audience get to see flashes of Rick's memories playing on a screen. And right there, clear as day, we see Rick holding a baby. Not just any baby. The baby is wearing Morty's iconic yellow shirt. The baby is Morty. Rick has actual memories stored in his brain of Morty as an infant. This shouldn't be possible. Rick wasn't there when Morty was a baby. He was gone. He'd been gone for 20 years. The timeline doesn't allow for Rick to have these memories. But there they are, showing up during a brain scan that's pulling real memories directly from Rick's head. The machine can't make up fake memories. It's literally reading what's actually in Rick's brain. So these memories of baby Morty are real. Rick genuinely remembers holding infant Morty. The show doesn't just show us these memories once and move on. In the episode Get Swifty, Morty ends up at his grandfather's friend Bird Person's house. While he's there, Morty notices photographs on the wall. These aren't just any random photos. One of them clearly shows a younger version of Rick holding a baby Morty. It's a printed photograph that exists in the physical world. Bird Person has this picture hanging in his home. This means at some point, someone took this photo, developed it, and gave it to Bird Person to keep. Think about what this means. This isn't a memory that could be wrong or misremembered. This isn't Rick imagining something or the show playing tricks with flashbacks. This is an actual photograph. Photographs don't lie about when they were taken. If there's a photo of Rick holding baby Morty, then Rick was physically present when Morty was a baby. But according to the show's own timeline, that's impossible. Let's break down the math one more time to really show how broken this is. Morty is 14. If Rick was gone for 20 years, then Rick left 6 years before Morty was born. But photos and memories show Rick was there when Morty was an infant. Let's say Morty was 1 year old in these photos. photos. That means Rick would have had to come back 19 years into his disappearance, be there for Morty's first year of life, then leave again. But that's not what the show tells us happened. The show says Rick was gone for 20 years straight, then came back right before the series starts. No one in the show acts like Rick was popping in and out during his absence. Beth talks about her dad abandoning her, not about him showing up randomly when Morty was a baby and then leaving again. Jerry doesn't mention Rick being around during Morty's infancy. Beth has serious abandonment issues from her father leaving, and the show treats Rick's return as him showing up after decades of being completely gone. If Rick had come back when Morty was a baby, even briefly, someone would mention it. But no one does. This is why fans started asking questions. This is why people began creating theories. The show presents us with a clear timeline that should be simple to follow, but then it shows us evidence that directly goes against that timeline. It's not a small continuity error that doesn't matter. These photos and memories are shown during important episodes. The memory scan happens during one of the most significant episodes of Season 1, the episode that introduces Evil Morty and the whole Citadel of Ricks. The photograph appears in an episode where Morty is questioning whether Rick actually cares about anyone. These aren't throwaway moments. The show wants us to see these images. Some people might say this is just a mistake by the writers. Maybe they forgot their own timeline. Maybe the photos were just meant to be sweet images showing Rick and Morty's bond, and nobody thought about whether the math worked. But Rick and Morty is an incredibly detailed show. Dan Harmon, one of the creators, is known for being super careful about story structure and continuity. The writers planned things seasons in advance. Evil Morty appeared in Season 1 and didn't show up again until Season 3. But when he returned, it was clear the writers had been planning his story the whole time. This show doesn't usually make big timeline mistakes by accident. So if it's not a mistake, then what's going on? Why would the show deliberately give us a timeline that doesn't make sense? Why show us photos and memories of Rick with baby Morty when Rick wasn't supposed to be there? The most obvious answer, the one that thousands of fans came to, is that these memories and photos aren't of the current Morty. They're of a different Morty. A previous Morty. An original Morty, who came before the Morty we've been following throughout the series. This idea seems wild at first, but the show gives us proof that Ricks can and do switch Mortys. In the episode Rick Potion number 9, Rick and Morty completely destroy their entire dimension. They turn everyone into horrible monsters. Rick can't fix it. So what does Rick do? He finds another dimension where a different Rick managed to fix the problem, but then that Rick and Morty died in an explosion. Our Rick and Morty jump into that dimension, bury their dead alternate selves in the backyard, and just take over their lives. Morty is clearly traumatized by this. He had to bury his own dead body. But Rick acts like this is no big deal. The ease with which Rick does this tells us he's comfortable with the idea of replacing himself and replacing Morty. He knows exactly how to find a dimension where they can slot into new lives. He doesn't hesitate. Later in the series, we see that the Citadel of Ricks, which is like a government made up of different Ricks from across the multiverse, has an actual system for Ricks to get replacement Mortys if theirs dies or gets too damaged. There are vouchers. There's paperwork. It's a normal process that happens often enough that they built an entire system around it. If Ricks regularly switch out their Mortys, and if our Rick knows exactly how to replace himself and Morty in a new dimension, then why couldn't Rick have had a different Morty before? Maybe Rick had an original Morty, back when he first invented his portal gun and started jumping through dimensions. Maybe something happened to that first Morty. Maybe that Morty died, or maybe Rick abandoned him, or maybe that Morty left Rick. Whatever happened, Rick ended up needing a new Morty. So, he found a dimension where a Rick had never come back to his family, and our Rick took that absent Rick's place. This would explain everything. The photos and memories are real, because Rick really did hold a baby Morty. Just not this Morty, not the one we've been watching. The baby in those photos and memories would be Rick's first Morty, his original grandson from whatever dimension Rick actually came from. Rick kept those memories because that's really his past. The photo at Bird Person's house would be from back when Rick had his original Morty with him on adventures. When Rick shows up at Beth's house at the start of the series, he's not actually her original father. He's a Rick from a different dimension, taking the place of a Rick who left and never came back. This Beth's real father is gone forever. But she doesn't know that because this Rick is identical to her Rick. Same person, just from a different universe. This means the Morty we follow through the show isn't Rick's biological grandson. He's the grandson of whatever Rick originally belonged to this dimension, but that Rick is gone. Our Rick just stepped into his life. The timeline math suddenly works if you accept this theory. Rick could be gone from his original dimension for way more than 20 years. He could have spent decades adventuring with his original Morty before something happened that separated them. Then Rick found this new dimension with this new family and pretended to be their Rick who was returning after 20 years away. The Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty of this dimension think their Rick just came home. They have no idea they're living with a completely different Rick who's pretending to be their family member. This is dark, but it fits with who Rick is as a character. Rick lies constantly. He manipulates everyone around him. He's done horrible things and feels no guilt. Taking over someone else's life and family would be exactly the kind of thing Rick would do if it benefited him. And we know he needs a Morty. The show explains that Morty's brainwaves hide Rick's genius brainwaves from enemies. Ricks need Mortys as a kind of shield. So if Rick lost his original Morty and needed a new one, finding a dimension with a Morty he could claim makes perfect sense. But if this theory is true, then where is Rick's original Morty? What happened to him? Did he die? Is he out there somewhere in the multiverse? And if Rick abandoned him or lost him somehow, could that Morty be angry about it? Angry enough to want revenge? Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. That's where Evil Morty comes in. But before we get into Evil Morty's suspicious connection to all of this, we need to look at those photos more closely, because there's something strange about them that makes this mystery even deeper. Section 2. The photos that shouldn't exist. The photograph hanging on Bird Person's wall isn't some blurry background detail that fans noticed after watching the episode 20 times. The show makes sure we see it. In the episode Get Swifty, Morty ends up at Bird Person's house during a crisis involving these giant floating heads that are threatening to destroy Earth. While Rick is dealing with the aliens, Morty has a conversation with Bird Person about whether Rick actually cares about anyone or if he's just a selfish monster who uses people. During this conversation, Morty's looking around Bird Person's house, and his eyes land on some photographs on the wall. These aren't random decorations. They're specific photos from Bird Person's past adventures with Rick. The show zooms in so we can see them clearly. One photo shows Rick, Bird Person, and their friend Squanchy hanging out together, looking much younger than they do now. These photos are meant to show us that Rick and Bird Person have been friends for a very long time, way before the show started. But there's another photo in this collection, one that shows Rick holding a baby. The baby is wearing a yellow shirt. The exact same yellow shirt that Morty wears throughout the entire series. There's no question about who this baby is supposed to be. The show wants us to recognize it as Morty. Rick is holding infant Morty in his arms, and someone took a photograph of this moment. That photograph somehow ended up in Bird Person's possession, and he thought it was important enough to frame and hang on his wall with his other treasured memories. Let's think about what has to be true for this photo to exist. First, Rick had to be physically present with baby Morty. You can't take a photo of something that never happened. Second, someone had to take this photo. Either Rick, Bird Person, or someone else had a camera and decided this moment was worth capturing. Third, the photo had to be developed and printed, because this is a physical photograph hanging on a wall, not a digital file. Fourth, this photo had to make its way to Bird Person, which means Rick either gave it to him, or Bird Person was there when it was taken. All of this requires time. It requires Rick spending time with baby Morty, enough time for casual photographs to be taken. These aren't official family portraits where everyone poses awkwardly. This looks like a candid moment, like someone just snapped a picture during a normal day. This is the kind of photo you take when you're around someone regularly, when you're comfortable enough that taking pictures feels natural. This suggests Rick wasn't just passing through for 5 minutes. He was around baby Morty enough for photographs like this to happen. Now, remember the timeline problem from the last section. Rick was supposedly gone for 20 years. Morty is 14. Rick should have never been around when Morty was a baby. But here's photo evidence that he was. You can't argue with a photograph. It's physical proof that exists in the world of the show. Some people might say, maybe the show just made a mistake. Maybe the writers put this photo in as a cute detail without thinking about whether it matched the timeline. But let's look at when and how this photo appears. It's not in some random episode about nothing important. It's in Get Swifty, during a conversation specifically about whether Rick cares about people. Morty is questioning Rick's entire character. Bird Person is trying to explain to Morty that Rick is more complicated than he seems, that despite his terrible behavior, Rick does have feelings and attachments. The photo shows up during this exact conversation. It's not an accident. The show is using this photo to tell us something about Rick's past, about his relationships, about who he's been connected to. If it was just a continuity error, why put it in such an important scene? Why make sure the camera focuses on it? The writers of Rick and Morty are incredibly careful about details. This is a show where things mentioned in Season 1 pay off in Season 5. They plan ahead. They don't usually make big, obvious mistakes about their own story. The memory of baby Morty appears even earlier, back in Season 1, during close Rick counters of the Rick kind. This is the episode where we first meet Evil Morty, though we don't know he's evil yet. The episode is full of important information about how the multiverse works, about the Citadel of Ricks, about the relationship between Ricks and Mortys. It's not a throwaway comedy episode. It's one of the most important episodes for understanding the whole series. In this episode, an evil version of Rick captures our Rick and hooks him up to a machine. This machine scans through Rick's brain, looking through all his memories to find something specific. While the scan is happening, we see Rick's memories flash on a screen. These aren't fake memories or dreams or stories Rick is telling. These are actual memories pulled directly from his brain. The machine is basically reading Rick's mind, showing us real things that Rick experienced and remembers. During this memory scan, we see all kinds of images from Rick's past. We see him as a younger man, we see him on adventures, we see moments from his life across different times and places. And we see him holding a baby Morty. It's brief, just a flash, but it's there. Rick's brain contains a genuine memory of holding infant Morty. This memory exists inside Rick's head as something that really happened to him. Here's what makes this so important. The machine pulling these memories isn't showing us what Rick wants people to see. It's not reading a story Rick made up. It's forcibly extracting actual memories from his brain against his will. Rick has no control over what the machine shows. So when we see baby Morty in Rick's memories, we're seeing something Rick actually experienced. Rick genuinely remembers holding Morty as an infant. Watch Rick's face during this memory scan. Most of the time, Rick doesn't show real emotions. He hides behind sarcasm and anger and drunk rambling. But during this scene, when his memories are being ripped out of his head and displayed, Rick looks vulnerable. He looks actually upset. This is one of the few times in the entire show where we see Rick drop his defenses completely. And among the memories that are important enough to be stored in his brain, important enough to show up during this scan, is a memory of baby Morty. The show gives us the photo evidence and the memory evidence in two separate episodes. First, the memory in Season 1, then the photo in Season 2. Both times, these images appear during significant moments. The memory shows up when we're learning about the Citadel and Evil Morty. The photo shows up when Morty is questioning Rick's capacity to care about people. These aren't random placements. The show is deliberately showing us that Rick has a history with baby Morty, a history that shouldn't exist according to the timeline. Think about Bird Person's role in all this. Bird Person is Rick's oldest friend. They've known each other for decades. They fought in wars together. They've been through things that we only get hints about in the show. Bird Person knows Rick better than almost anyone. He's seen Rick at his best and his worst. And Bird Person has this photo of Rick with baby Morty displayed in his home. Why would Bird Person have this photo? The easy answer is that Rick gave it to him, or Bird Person was there when it was taken. Either way, this photo represents a time in Rick's past that Bird Person witnessed or knew about. Bird Person keeps photos of important moments and important people. He has photos of his adventures with Rick and Squanchy because those friendships matter to him. The fact that he also has a photo of Rick with baby Morty suggests that Rick with baby Morty was also an important time, something worth remembering and keeping. We never see photos of other Ricks with their baby Mortys. When we visit the Citadel of Ricks, where there are thousands of Ricks and Mortys from different dimensions, we don't see Ricks carrying around baby pictures. We don't see Ricks being sentimental about their Morty's childhood. The show makes it very clear that most Ricks see Mortys as tools, as camouflage, as disposable sidekicks. Ricks can get replacement Mortys through official channels. Mortys are described as products. There's a whole creepy factory where Mortys are created and assigned to Ricks. But our Rick is different. The Citadel calls him a rogue Rick. Other Ricks say he's too attached to his Morty. When Morty tells other Ricks that he's from dimension C137, Rick's home dimension, they look at each other with this weird expression. They seem surprised or confused. The show hints over and over that Rick's relationship with his Morty is unusual compared to how other Ricks treat their Mortys. So why does our Rick have photos and memories of baby Morty when other Ricks don't seem to care about that stuff? Why is our Rick emotionally attached in a way that other Ricks aren't? One explanation is that this Morty is special to Rick for some reason we don't understand yet. But another explanation, one that makes a lot of sense given the timeline problems, is that Rick had a different Morty before. A Morty he actually raised from infancy. A Morty he was around for enough to take casual photos with. A Morty he lost somehow. If Rick had an original Morty that he spent years with, that would explain why he has these deep memories. It would explain the photo at Bird Person's house, because that would be from back when Rick had his first Morty and was still friends with Bird Person. It would explain why Rick seems more attached to Morty than other Ricks are to theirs, because maybe he's trying to make up for losing the first one. Or maybe he's trying to protect this Morty from whatever happened to the original. There's a moment in the memory scan that's easy to miss, but really important. When Rick's memories of baby Morty flash on the screen, Rick's face shows actual pain. Not physical pain from the machine, but emotional pain from the memory. Rick quickly hides it, but for just a second, we see genuine hurt. Why would a memory of baby Morty cause Rick pain? If Rick wasn't around for this Morty's childhood because he was gone for 20 years, then seeing a memory of baby Morty shouldn't hurt. It should be confusing because the memory shouldn't exist, but it shouldn't be painful. But if that memory is of a different Morty, a Morty that Rick lost, then the pain makes sense. That memory would represent a time before something bad happened, a time when Rick had his original Morty and things were different. Looking at that memory would hurt because it reminds Rick of what he lost. This is all theory, but it fits with what we see on screen. It explains both why the memory exists and why it makes Rick react with emotion. The show never directly tells us what these photos and memories mean. Rick doesn't sit down and explain his past. He doesn't talk about where these images came from. The show just presents them and lets us notice the contradiction. It's like the writers are giving us puzzle pieces but not telling us how they fit together. We have to figure it out ourselves. And thousands of fans did try to figure it out. They noticed the timeline didn't work. They saw the photos and memories. They watched Rick's reactions. And they came up with the theory that Rick had an original Morty before the Morty we watch in the show. A first Morty who Rick was actually around for during infancy. A Morty who appears in Rick's memories and in Bird Person's photos. A Morty who, for some reason, isn't with Rick anymore. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This theory gained even more support when fans started looking at Evil Morty's behavior. Because Evil Morty doesn't just randomly hate all Ricks, he specifically goes after Rick C137. He targets our Rick in particular. He frames Rick for crimes. He hacks Rick's portal gun specifically. He downloads Rick's brain to get information. Out of infinite Ricks across infinite dimensions, Evil Morty chooses to focus on this one Rick. Why? What makes Rick C137 special to Evil Morty? Unless they have history, unless they know each other, unless Evil Morty has a very personal reason to go after this specific Rick. Section 3. Evil Morty's laser-focused obsession. Evil Morty first appears in the episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, though at the time we don't know he's the villain. We think the bad guy is this scarred, evil-looking Rick who's been killing other Ricks across different dimensions. The episode opens with this evil Rick murdering another Rick and kidnapping that Rick's Morty. It's brutal and scary, showing us that even Ricks can be in serious danger from each other. The Council of Ricks, which is basically a government made up of different Ricks from across the multiverse, has been investigating these murders. They've been trying to figure out which Rick is responsible for killing 27 other Ricks and torturing hundreds of Mortys. They need to catch whoever is doing this before more Ricks die. And then, suddenly, they think they found their killer. They come for our Rick, Rick C137, and arrest him for these crimes. But Rick didn't do it. He's being framed. Someone hacked into Rick's portal gun, the device he uses to travel between dimensions. and they uploaded fake information to make it look like Rick had been traveling to all the dimensions where Ricks were murdered. The evidence points directly at Rick C137. His portal gun's travel history shows him going to every single location where a murder happened. The council looks at this evidence and decides Rick must be guilty. They capture him and put him on trial. Here's the question nobody asks in the moment because everything is happening so fast. Why Rick C137? There are infinite Ricks across infinite dimensions. The show makes this very clear. There are so many Ricks that they built an entire city called the Citadel just to have a place where Ricks can gather. We see thousands of Ricks in this one place, and that's not even all of them. There are Ricks everywhere, in every dimension, living every possible version of a Rick's life. So if you're evil Rick and you want to frame someone for your crimes, you could pick literally any Rick in the entire multiverse. You could frame a Rick from a dimension you've never been to. You could frame some random Rick who has nothing to do with you. You could frame 5 different Ricks to spread out the suspicion. With infinite Ricks to choose from, why would you specifically target Rick C137? The episode shows us that framing Rick C137 wasn't easy. To make it work, Evil Morty had to do something incredibly difficult. He had to hack Rick C137's portal gun specifically. Not just any portal gun, but that exact one. Portal guns are the most advanced technology in the entire show. They would allow Ricks to travel between dimensions instantly. They're complicated devices that only Ricks can build and understand. And someone managed to hack into Rick C137's portal gun remotely, upload false travel data, and make it look real enough to fool the entire Council of Ricks. This wasn't some quick, easy trick. This took serious skill, serious intelligence, and serious planning. Whoever did this had to know exactly how Rick C137's portal gun worked. They had to be able to break into its systems without Rick noticing. They had to know enough about Rick's travel patterns to make the fake data look believable. And they had to do all of this while staying completely hidden. When Rick figures out he's being framed, he escapes from the Citadel and tracks down who's really responsible. He finds Evil Rick's hidden base, and that's when things get really interesting. Evil Rick captures Rick and Morty and straps Rick into a chair. He hooks Rick up to a machine that's going to download everything in Rick's brain. Every memory, every piece of knowledge, every secret Rick has ever had, all of it is about to be copied and stolen. Evil Rick explains what he's doing while the machine works. He's going through Rick's entire brain, looking at all his memories, taking all his knowledge. And while this is happening, Evil Rick mocks our Rick. He makes fun of Rick for caring about Morty, for showing emotion during the memory scan. Evil Rick says that Ricks don't actually care about Mortys, that they're just tools, just camouflage. He acts like our Rick is weak for having feelings. But think about what's happening here. Evil Rick went to enormous effort to specifically capture Rick C137. He built this entire operation around getting this particular Rick into this chair so he could download this particular Rick's brain. He's not downloading just any Rick's brain. He specifically needs what's inside Rick C137's head. Out of all the infinite Ricks he could have captured, out of all the infinite brains he could have downloaded, he chose this one. Why? What's so special about Rick C137's brain? What information does Rick C137 have that other Ricks don't? The episode doesn't answer this directly, but it shows us that Rick C137 is different from other Ricks. Later in the series, we learn that Rick C137 is called the Rickest Rick. Other Ricks are afraid of him. The Council considers him dangerous. He has a reputation. He's not just another Rick in the crowd. He's someone important, someone other Ricks pay attention to. After the brain download finishes, the Mortys that Evil Rick kidnapped manage to break free. They're being held prisoner and tortured in this horrible place, and they finally rebel. They overpower Evil Rick's guards and beat Evil Rick to death. It's a violent scene, and Evil Rick actually seems to welcome it, like he wants to die. The Mortys keep hitting him even after he's dead, and that's when the Council of Ricks shows up and stops them. The Council sends Evil Rick's body for examination to figure out what happened. And that's when they discover something shocking. Evil Rick has cybernetic implants in his brain. He has a receiver installed in his head. Someone was controlling him remotely this entire time. Evil Rick wasn't the real villain. He was a puppet, a robot being operated by someone else. The episode cuts to the Citadel, where all the captured Morties are being processed and returned to their proper dimensions. One of these Morties is wearing an eye patch. He looks like just another victim, just another Morty who got caught up in evil Rick's crimes. But then, when no one's watching, he takes off his eye patch. Inside the eye patch is a transmitter, the device that was controlling evil Rick. This Morty was the real villain all along. This is Evil Morty. He crushes the transmitter under his foot and walks away, disappearing into the crowd of Mortys. Nobody knows what he did. Nobody suspects him. Let's think about what this means. Evil Morty built all of this. He turned his own Rick into a mind-controlled slave. He created the technology to control Rick remotely. He murdered 27 Ricks from different dimensions. He kidnapped and tortured hundreds of Mortys. He built a secret base. He planned and executed an incredibly complicated scheme to frame Rick C137 specifically, and he did it all while pretending to be a normal, helpless Morty. This tells us several things about Evil Morty. First, he's a genius. He's smart enough to build technology that can control a Rick's brain. He's smart enough to hack portal guns. He's smart enough to fool the entire council of Ricks. Most Mortys are shown to be kinda dumb, or at least not very smart compared to Ricks. But Evil Morty is different. He's incredibly intelligent, possibly as smart as a Rick. Second, Evil Morty is patient. This plan took time. Controlling his Rick, murdering Ricks across dimensions, setting up the frame job, building the secret base. All of this required months or maybe years of preparation. He didn't rush. He waited for the right moment. He made sure everything was perfect before making his move. Third, and this is the important part, Evil Morty has a specific goal related to Rick C137. Everything he did was aimed at getting Rick C137 captured and getting access to Rick C137's brain. The murders, the kidnappings, even turning his own Rick into a puppet, all of it led to this one objective: get Rick C137. Download Rick C137's brain. Get the information inside Rick C137's head. If Evil Morty just wanted to download a Rick's brain for information, he could have done it way easier. He already controlled a Rick completely. He could have downloaded his own Rick's brain anytime he wanted. He didn't need to frame someone and lure them to his base. But he did anyway, which means his own Rick's brain wasn't enough. He specifically needed what was in Rick C137's head. If Evil Morty just hated Ricks in general and wanted to kill them, he could have kept killing Ricks across dimensions. He was good at it. He'd already killed 27. He could have killed more. But that's not what he did. He stopped killing once he got Rick C137's attention. The murders were bait to draw Rick C137 out. Once Rick C137 was captured, the killing stopped. Evil Morty got what he wanted. This suggests Evil Morty's problem isn't with Ricks in general. His problem is specifically with Rick C137. Or at least, Rick C137 has something Evil Morty desperately needs. Something worth building this entire elaborate plan around. Something worth killing 27 Ricks and torturing hundreds of Mortys to obtain. Fans watching this episode noticed all of these details. They saw how everything pointed at Rick C137 specifically. They saw how personal it seemed. And they started asking why. Why would a Morty care so much about one particular Rick? Why would a Morty be smart enough to pull this off? Why would a Morty hate Ricks enough to do these terrible things? The easy answer is that Evil Morty is just evil for no reason. That he's a bad guy because the show needed a villain. But Rick and Morty doesn't usually work that way. Characters have motivations. They have reasons for what they do. Even Rick, who does awful things constantly, has reasons behind his actions. The show eventually explains why Rick is the way he is, why he drinks so much, why he's so angry and sad all the time. The show gives characters depth. So what's Evil Morty's depth? What's his motivation? What made him become this way? And why does his entire plan revolve around Rick C137? These questions don't get answered in the episode. Evil Morty crushes his transmitter and disappears. We don't see him again for a long time. He's out there, somewhere in the multiverse, and now he has a complete copy of everything inside Rick C137's brain. He has all of Rick's memories, all of Rick's knowledge, all of Rick's secrets. What's he going to do with that information? And more importantly, why did Rick C137 specifically matter so much to Evil Morty's plan? unless there's a personal connection between them. Unless Evil Morty knows Rick C137 from somewhere. Unless Evil Morty has a reason to specifically target this Rick above all others. But if Evil Morty and Rick C137 have history together, where would that history come from? Rick's been gone for 20 years. Morty is only 14. They shouldn't have any shared past. Unless Rick is lying about his timeline. Unless Rick had a different Morty before. Unless the baby in those photos and memories is actually Evil Morty, and something terrible happened between them that turned Evil Morty into what he is now. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. That's the theory fans came up with, and the more you look at the evidence, the more sense it makes. But before we talk about Evil Morty being Rick's original Morty, we need to understand something Rick said at the end of this episode. A warning that might explain everything. A warning about what happens when a Morty gets too smart. Section 4. A cocky Morty is dangerous. After all the chaos of close Rick counters of the Rick kind, after evil Rick is defeated and the Mortys are rescued, Rick and Morty head home. They've just been through this huge adventure. They were captured by the Council of Ricks. Rick was put on trial for murders he didn't commit. They escaped, they tracked down the real killer, and they survived. Morty helped solve the case. He figured out important clues. He wasn't just Rick's sidekick dragged along for the ride. He actually contributed to stopping evil Rick. Morty feels good about this. For once, he didn't mess everything up. He didn't panic and make things worse. He used his brain and helped save the day. It's a rare moment where Morty gets to feel smart and capable instead of stupid and useless. Rick constantly tells Morty he's dumb, constantly reminds him that his brain waves are stupid enough to hide Rick's genius, constantly treats him like he's worthless. So when Morty actually does something intelligent and helpful, it matters to him. They're walking away from the Citadel, heading back to their normal lives, and Morty is feeling confident. He's got a little swagger in his step. He's starting to think maybe he's not as dumb as Rick always says. Maybe he's actually pretty clever when he tries. Maybe he could be good at this whole adventure thing if Rick would just give him a chance and stop putting him down all the time. Rick notices Morty's attitude. He sees Morty walking with his head held high, feeling proud of himself. And Rick doesn't like it. He stops and turns to Morty with this serious expression. Rick rarely gets serious. Usually he's joking or drunk or angry or sarcastic. But in this moment, Rick looks genuinely concerned. He looks like he's about to say something important. Rick tells Morty that he did a good job. He admits that Morty was helpful. But then Rick's tone changes. He gets this dark, warning sound in his voice. He tells Morty not to let it go to his head. He says that a cocky Morty can be a real problem. Those are his exact words. A cocky Morty can be a real problem. Morty asks what Rick means. This seems like a weird thing for Rick to say. Why would Morty being confident be a problem? Rick is cocky all the time. Rick constantly brags about how smart he is, how he's the smartest person in the universe, how everyone else is stupid compared to him. Rick's entire personality is based on being overly confident to the point of arrogance. So why is it suddenly bad when Morty feels a little bit good about himself? Rick doesn't answer the question. Instead, he tells Morty he'll understand when he's older. He'll explain it all someday when Morty is old enough to hear it. But not now. Not yet. Morty needs to stay young and dumb for a while longer. The conversation ends there. Rick walks away, and Morty is left confused. What was that about? Why did Rick give him that warning? What does Rick know about cocky Mortys that Morty doesn't? This moment is strange for several reasons. First, Rick almost never says he'll explain something later. Usually Rick either explains things immediately with way too much detail, or he refuses to explain anything at all and tells Morty to shut up and stop asking questions. Rick doesn't do this middle ground thing where he hints that there's important information but says Morty isn't ready to hear it yet. That's not how Rick normally acts. Second, Rick seems genuinely worried. This isn't Rick making a joke or being mean for fun. Rick actually looks concerned about Morty getting too confident. He sees Morty feeling smart and capable, and instead of being happy that his grandson is growing and learning, Rick wants to shut it down immediately. He wants to put Morty back in his place, remind him to stay dumb and obedient. Third, and this is the most important part, Rick speaks like he knows what he's talking about from experience. He doesn't say a cocky Morty could theoretically be a problem, or I imagine a cocky Morty might cause issues. He says a cocky Morty can be a real problem, stated as a fact. This suggests Rick has actually seen what happens when a Morty becomes too confident, too smart, too capable. He's not guessing. He knows. Throughout the series, we learn more about why Ricks keep Mortys around. It's not because they love their grandsons or want to spend time with family. Ricks use Mortys as camouflage. The show explains that Morty's dumb brainwaves cancel out Rick's genius brainwaves. When Rick and Morty are together, Rick's brain becomes harder to detect by enemies or governments or anyone trying to track down Rick's location. Morty is basically a human shield that makes Rick invisible to scanners. For this camouflage to work, Morty needs to stay dumb. If Morty gets smarter, his brainwaves change. If his brainwaves change, they don't hide Rick's brain anymore. A smart Morty is a useless Morty from Rick's perspective, at least when it comes to the camouflage function. So Rick has a practical reason to keep Morty stupid. Rick needs Morty to be dumb for the camouflage to keep working. But Rick's warning about cocky Mortys seems to go beyond just the camouflage issue. Rick isn't saying, don't get smart because then you won't hide my brainwaves anymore. He's saying a cocky Morty is a problem, a danger, something to be worried about. This implies that a confident, intelligent Morty is a threat in some way. Not just useless, but actually dangerous. Dangerous to who? To Rick? Is Rick saying that if Morty gets too smart, Morty might become a threat to Rick himself? That seems to be what Rick is hinting at. A Morty who knows too much, who can think for himself, who doesn't just blindly follow Rick's orders. That kind of Morty could be a real problem for Rick. That kind of Morty might question Rick's decisions, might stand up to Rick, might even turn against Rick. We just watched an entire episode about a Morty who did exactly that. Evil Morty turned his Rick into a mind-controlled puppet. Evil Morty outsmarted an entire government of Ricks. Evil Morty proved that a Morty with intelligence and confidence is incredibly dangerous. Evil Morty showed us exactly what a cocky Morty looks like when taken to the extreme. And Rick is giving this warning at the end of the same episode where Evil Morty appeared. Is Rick thinking about Evil Morty when he gives this warning? Did seeing Evil Morty's actions remind Rick of something from his past? Did Evil Morty prove something Rick already knew? Something Rick had learned from experience before? The timing is suspicious. Rick doesn't give warnings like this randomly. He says this right after encountering a Morty who was smart enough and confident enough to fool everyone, including Rick himself for most of the episode. There's another weird thing about this warning. Rick says Morty will understand when he's older. What does age have to do with it? What will Morty understand at 16 or 18 or 20 that he can't understand at 14? Unless Rick is talking about understanding through experience. Maybe Rick means that someday Morty will be old enough to hear the full story of what happened with a previous cocky Morty. Maybe Rick has a history with a Morty who got too smart, and he'll tell our Morty about it eventually. Throughout the series, we see Rick actively trying to keep Morty dumb. Rick insults Morty's intelligence constantly. Rick tells Morty he's stupid, worthless, that his ideas are bad, that he should stop thinking and just do what Rick says. Some of this is just Rick being a jerk, but some of it seems intentional. Rick is training Morty to doubt himself, to not trust his own brain, to stay dependent on Rick for everything. But despite Rick's efforts, Morty keeps getting smarter. Over the seasons, Morty becomes more capable. He learns how to use Rick's gadgets. He starts coming up with his own plans. He questions Rick more often. He stands up to Rick when he thinks Rick is wrong. Morty is slowly becoming exactly what Rick warned against. A Morty who's confident and intelligent instead of scared and dumb. Rick sees this happening and it clearly bothers him. There are multiple episodes where Rick seems frustrated that Morty is learning too much or becoming too independent. Rick will erase Morty's memories sometimes to literally remove the knowledge and experience Morty is gaining. Rick keeps trying to reset Morty back to being the dumb, scared kid who needs Rick for everything. Why is Rick so desperate to keep Morty stupid? If it was just about the camouflage, Rick could explain that. He could say, "Hey Morty, I need your brain to stay dumb for science reasons." But Rick doesn't explain. He just gives vague warnings and says Morty will understand later. This suggests the real reason is more complicated, more personal, more painful than just needing camouflage. What if Rick had another Morty who got too smart? What if Rick's original Morty started out dumb and scared like all Mortys, but over time, through years of adventures, that Morty learned too much? What if that Morty became confident, capable, intelligent? What if that Morty started questioning Rick, started seeing through Rick's manipulation, started realizing how toxic and abusive their relationship was? And what if that smart, confident, awakened Morty decided he'd had enough? What if he turned against Rick? What if he became the exact kind of problem Rick warns about? A Morty who uses everything Rick taught him against Rick himself. That would explain why Rick is so terrified of it happening again. That would explain why Rick keeps trying to keep this Morty dumb and dependent. Rick learned the hard way what happens when a Morty gets too cocky. Could Evil Morty be that original Morty? The one who got too smart and became a problem? The timeline would work if Evil Morty was Rick's first grandson, the one from the photos and memories. Rick spent years adventuring with his original Morty. That Morty learned from Rick, grew smarter, gained confidence. Eventually, that Morty became cocky, as Rick would put it. He stopped being the scared sidekick and started being his own person with his own ideas and opinions. Rick couldn't handle that. Rick needs Mortys to be obedient and scared. He needs them to worship him and do whatever he says. A Morty who questions him, who challenges him, who might be almost as smart as him, that's Rick's worst nightmare. So something happened between Rick and his original Morty. Maybe they had a huge fight. Maybe Rick said something unforgivable. Maybe Rick did something terrible. Maybe Rick abandoned that Morty, or maybe that Morty left Rick. Either way, that relationship ended badly. And that first Morty, that original cocky Morty, became Evil Morty. He became a Morty who hates Rick so much that he's willing to murder dozens of Ricks to get revenge. He became smart enough to outsmart Rick. He became confident enough to take on the entire Citadel. He became exactly what Rick warned about, the real problem that a cocky Morty represents. This would explain why Rick gives this warning right after the Evil Morty episode. Seeing Evil Morty reminded Rick of his past. Seeing what Evil Morty accomplished, how smart and dangerous he was. That was like looking at his old mistakes. Rick knows what a cocky Morty can do because he created one. He turned his first Morty into Evil Morty through years of abuse and manipulation and adventures until that Morty snapped. Now Rick has a new Morty, a second chance. And Rick is determined not to make the same mistake twice. He's gonna keep this Morty dumb. He's gonna keep this Morty scared. He's gonna keep this Morty dependent on him, no matter what. Because Rick knows what happens when a Morty gets too smart. Rick has seen the problem a cocky Morty can be, and Rick can't let it happen again. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But there's evidence beyond just Rick's warning. There's something in the show's opening credits that plays at the start of every single episode. Something that fans noticed and couldn't stop thinking about. A brief scene that shows Rick abandoning a Morty to die, leaving him behind without a second thought. Section 5. The intro sequence. Abandonment. Every episode of Rick and Morty starts with an opening credits sequence. This isn't unusual. Most TV shows have some kind of intro that plays before each episode begins, but Rick and Morty's intro is special because it shows quick flashes of different scenes, some from actual episodes and some made just for the credits. These scenes change from season to season. The show updates the intro with new images to reflect what's happening in the current season. But there's one scene that never changes. One specific moment that appears in the intro for Season 1, Season 2, Season 3, all the way through every season the show has made. While other clips get replaced with new ones, while the intro evolves and updates, this one particular scene stays exactly the same. Rick and Morty running from creatures, Rick escaping through a portal, and Morty being left behind. Let's describe exactly what happens in this scene. Rick and Morty are running away from these large, green, frog-like alien creatures. The creatures look dangerous and hungry. They're chasing Rick and Morty across some alien planet's landscape. Rick pulls out his portal gun while they're running. He shoots it at the ground, creating a portal, a green, swirling hole that leads to somewhere else, somewhere safe. Rick doesn't slow down. He doesn't wait for Morty. He doesn't look back. Rick jumps straight into the portal while still running full speed. He escapes through it instantly, disappearing from this dangerous planet. But Morty isn't fast enough. Morty trips and falls. He hits the ground hard. The portal is still there, still open, but Morty is on the ground and the creatures are right behind him. The scene cuts away before we see what happens next. We don't see the creatures attack Morty. We don't see Morty get away. We just see Morty on the ground surrounded by these monsters with the portal closing. And Rick already gone. Rick abandoned him. Rick saved himself and left Morty to die. That's what the scene shows us. Clear and simple. Rick had the chance to help Morty and chose not to. This scene lasts maybe 3 seconds. It goes by so fast that if you blink, you might miss it. But it plays at the start of every single episode. Hundreds of times across all the seasons, this same moment repeats. Rick running, portal opening, Rick escaping, Morty falling, Morty being left behind. Over and over, the show makes us watch Rick abandon Morty. Why keep this specific scene? The intro changes everything else. Different seasons show different adventures, different aliens, different situations. Season 4's intro has completely different clips than Season 1's intro. Season 7 updated the intro again with new scenes. But this abandonment moment stays. Through all the updates, through all the changes, the show keeps showing us Rick leaving Morty behind to die. Fans noticed this immediately. They started asking questions. They started making theories. The most popular theory was that this scene shows something important from the past. Not something that will happen in a future episode, but something that already happened before the show started. Maybe this is how Rick lost his original Morty. Maybe this shows the moment Rick abandoned his first grandson, leaving him on an alien planet to be killed by monsters. The theory made sense to a lot of people. If Rick had a previous Morty, if that Morty appears in the photos and memories we talked about earlier, then something must have happened to that Morty. Rick doesn't have him anymore. That first Morty isn't around. So what happened? Did he die? Did Rick lose him somehow? The intro scene could be showing us exactly how it happened. Rick left his original Morty behind during an adventure gone wrong. But here's the part that made this theory really interesting to fans. What if the Morty in this scene didn't actually die? What if Morty survived somehow? What if Morty managed to fight off those creatures or escape or get rescued? What if Morty lived through being abandoned, but he was never the same afterward? What if that experience, being left to die by the person he trusted most, broke something inside him? Imagine being that Morty. You're running for your life, terrified, relying on your grandfather to save you like he always does. Rick has amazing technology. Rick can get out of any situation. You trust that Rick will protect you. Then Rick opens an escape route and takes it without you. He doesn't even pause. He doesn't try to grab your hand. He doesn't call out for you to hurry. He just leaves. He saves himself and abandons you to monsters without a second thought. If you survived that, if you somehow made it out alive, how would you feel about Rick afterward? You'd realize Rick doesn't actually care about you. You'd understand that when things get dangerous, Rick will sacrifice you to save himself. All those adventures, all those times Rick said you were partners, it was all lies. Rick sees you as disposable. Rick would rather let you die than risk his own safety. That kind of betrayal would change a person. That kind of abandonment would fill someone with anger and hurt. If this Morty survived, he wouldn't trust Rick ever again. He wouldn't want to be Rick's sidekick anymore. He might even want revenge. He might spend years planning how to get back at Rick for leaving him to die. He might become someone completely different from the scared, loyal Morty he used to be. He might become evil. Could this be Evil Morty's origin story? Could the Morty in the intro scene be Rick's original Morty, the one from the photos? And could this abandonment be what turned him into Evil Morty? It would explain why Evil Morty hates Rick so much. It would explain why Evil Morty specifically targets Rick C137. It would explain why Evil Morty is so intelligent and capable, because he had to learn how to survive after Rick left him. He couldn't rely on Rick anymore, so he had to become smart and strong on his own. The scene being in every single intro suggests it's important. Shows don't keep random, meaningless clips in their opening credits for 7 seasons straight. If the scene didn't matter, they would have replaced it with something else by now. But they keep it. They make sure we see it every episode. It's like the show is trying to tell us something, giving us a clue about Rick's past that we're supposed to notice and think about. There's also something else weird about this scene. In the actual show, we see Rick risk his life to save Morty multiple times. In the episode A Wrinkle in Time, Rick literally sacrifices himself to save Morty. Rick could have saved himself and let Morty die, but he chose to save Morty instead, even though it meant certain death for Rick. Morty ended up saving Rick at the last second, but the point is, Rick was willing to die for Morty. We see other moments where Rick protects Morty too. Rick goes to great lengths to keep Morty safe during adventures. Rick might be mean and abusive, but when Morty's life is actually in danger, Rick usually tries to save him. Rick isn't the kind of person who would just abandon Morty to monsters without even trying to help. At least, the Rick we watch in the show isn't like that. But the Rick in the intro scene is exactly like that. That Rick abandons Morty without hesitation. That Rick chooses his own safety over Morty's life. That Rick doesn't care if Morty dies. So either the intro is showing us a version of Rick from a different dimension, or it's showing us our Rick from a different time in his past. A time when Rick was colder, more selfish, before whatever happened that made Rick start caring about Morty. If this scene is from Rick's past with his original Morty, it would explain the difference. Maybe young Rick was worse than current Rick. Maybe Rick used to be the kind of person who would abandon his Morty without caring. Maybe something about losing his first Morty, whether through abandonment or death or however it ended, changed Rick. Maybe that's why current Rick is more protective of this Morty. He learned from his mistakes. He doesn't want to lose another one. The intro scene appears right at the beginning of every episode, right before the show's title appears. It's positioned as one of the most important images in the entire intro sequence. The opening credits tell a story in quick flashes. Rick and Morty running, adventuring, being chased, escaping. And right in the middle of all that chaos and excitement, there's this moment of betrayal. This moment where Rick proves he'll save himself first. Some fans went really deep analyzing this scene. They looked at what the creatures look like, trying to figure out what planet this might be. They looked at what Rick and Morty are wearing, seeing if their clothes match any specific time period or episode. They looked at the style of the portal, whether it's the same green portals Rick uses in the show or something different. People were searching for any clue that might tell them when and where this scene takes place. But the show never explained it. For seasons and seasons, this scene just sat there in the intro, with no context. No episode ever showed these specific frog creatures. No episode ever referenced Rick abandoning Morty on this particular planet. It was like a mystery the show planted right in front of our faces and then refused to solve. The creators knew fans were asking about it, knew people were making theories, and they just let those questions hang in the air without answers. This made fans even more convinced it meant something important. If it was just a random funny scene made for the intro, the creators would probably say so. They'd laugh about fans reading too much into it. But they didn't. They stayed quiet about it. They let the theories grow. They kept including the scene in every new season's intro. It felt intentional. It felt like they were saving the explanation for later, waiting for the right moment to reveal what this scene really means. When Evil Morty showed up in the show and proved that a Morty could be intelligent and dangerous and filled with hate for Rick, fans connected it to the intro scene immediately. Here was a Morty who had clearly been hurt by a Rick. Here was a Morty who survived something terrible and came back stronger and angrier. Could this be the same Morty from the intro? Could Evil Morty be the Morty who Rick abandoned, who survived against impossible odds, who spent years planning his revenge? The timing worked with the theory about Evil Morty being Rick's original Morty. If Rick had a first Morty that he adventured with for years, if that's the Morty in the photos and memories, then at some point Rick and that Morty got separated. The intro scene could show exactly how it happened. An adventure went wrong. Rick panicked and saved himself. Morty got left behind. Rick thought Morty died. But Morty didn't die. Morty survived. And Morty never forgave Rick for abandoning him. Years later, that abandoned Morty became Evil Morty. He turned his own Rick into a mind-controlled puppet, showing that he doesn't need Rick and will never trust a Rick again. He specifically targeted Rick C137, the Rick who abandoned him, framing him for crimes to get him captured. He downloaded Rick C137's brain, taking all the knowledge and secrets that Rick kept from him. It was all revenge for being left behind. That's the theory anyway. And for a long time it seemed to make perfect sense. It explained the intro scene. It explained Evil Morty's motivation. It explained why Evil Morty was so focused on Rick C137 specifically. It tied together all these loose threads into one complete story. Fans were pretty convinced they'd figured it out. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But theories are just theories until the show confirms them. And as more seasons came out, as we learned more about Rick and Evil Morty and the multiverse, the show started giving us actual answers. Not about the intro scene specifically, but about Rick's past in general, about where he really came from and whether he actually had an original Morty at all. But before we get to those revelations, we need to talk about how Rick acts around our Morty, because his behavior suggests something deeper is going on. Section 6. Rick's emotional attachment pattern. The Council of Ricks has a specific name for our Rick. They call him a rogue Rick. This comes up in the episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, when Rick is being framed for murdering other Ricks. One of the council members directly says that of all the Ricks in the central finite curve, Rick C137 is the malcontent, the rogue. They're basically saying Rick is the rebel Rick, the one who doesn't follow the rules, the one who's different from all the others. But what makes Rick a rogue? What makes him different from the thousands of other Ricks at the Citadel? They're all genius scientists, they all have portal guns, they all go on crazy adventures, they all act superior to everyone else. On the surface, all Ricks seem pretty much the same. So why does the Council single out Rick C137 as special, as someone who stands apart from the rest? The show gives us hints throughout multiple episodes. Other Ricks talk about Rick C137 like he's dangerous in a way they're not. In the episode The Rick Shank Rickdemption, when Rick is breaking out of prison and destroying the entire Galactic Federation government, the other Ricks at the Citadel refer to him as a terror Rick. That's not a compliment. They're saying Rick C137 is scary. He's the kind of Rick that even other Ricks are afraid of. He's done things that make other Ricks nervous. We see Rick's reputation in action when he shows up at the Citadel. Other Ricks recognize him. They know who he is. They treat him differently than they treat random Ricks. Some Ricks seem scared of him. Some seem impressed. All of them know his name and his dimension number. Rick C137 is famous among Ricks, and not in a good way. He's the Rick who destroyed the Citadel's government, who rejected their society, who refuses to play by their rules. But the thing that really makes Rick different from other Ricks isn't his crimes, or his reputation, or his rebellious attitude. It's how he treats Morty. And this is where things get really interesting for our theory about Rick having an original Morty before. Let's look at how most Ricks treat their Mortys. At the Citadel, we see hundreds of Ricks and Mortys living together in this massive city. The show makes it very clear that most Ricks see Mortys as tools, not as family members. Mortys exist to hide Rick's brainwaves from detection. That's their entire purpose. Their camouflage, nothing more. In the episode The Ricklantis Mix-Up, which shows us daily life at the Citadel, we see exactly how Ricks treat Mortys in their society. There are Mortys who work in factories. There are Mortys who do terrible jobs that no Rick would ever do. There are Mortys who get killed and nobody cares. The Citadel has an actual system where if a Rick's Morty dies or gets too damaged, that Rick can just get a replacement Morty. They hand out vouchers for new Mortys like they're handing out coupons for free sandwiches. We see Ricks talking about Mortys the way you talk about a car or a phone or any other object you own. When something breaks, you get a new one. When the current model gets old, you upgrade. Mortys aren't people to most Ricks. They're products. They're manufactured, assigned to Ricks, used up, and replaced. The whole system is designed around Mortys being disposable. Even the way Mortys are made is disturbing. The show reveals that many Mortys at the Citadel aren't natural grandchildren of Ricks. They're created in labs specifically to be sidekicks for Ricks. They're grown and programmed and assigned. It's like a factory that produces Mortys to meet demand. Need a Morty? Here, take one. Don't like this Morty? Trade him in for a different one. No emotions, no attachment, just business. So that's how normal Ricks treat their Mortys, like objects, like tools, like things that can be replaced when they stop being useful. Now let's look at how our Rick treats our Morty, because it's completely different. In the episode A Wrinkle in Time, something incredible happens. Rick and Morty get stuck in this situation where time is splitting into different possibilities. They're falling through the air, and there's only one way to fix the problem and save both of them. But Rick realizes he can't save both himself and Morty. he has to choose. Either Rick survives and Morty dies, or Morty survives and Rick dies. There's no third option. Rick chooses Morty. Without hesitation, without even having to think about it, Rick sacrifices himself to save Morty. Rick gives Morty the device that will save him and keeps the one that will kill him. Rick is completely calm about dying. He accepts it. He's okay with it as long as Morty lives. The only thing that bothers Rick is that Morty might waste his life after being saved. Rick tells Morty not to be an idiot, to make his survival count for something. Then, Rick prepares to die. At the last possible second, Morty saves Rick. Morty figures out a solution that Rick missed because Rick was too busy trying to sacrifice himself. They both survive. But the important part is that Rick was genuinely ready to die for Morty. He chose Morty's life over his own. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look for a way to save himself instead. He just accepted that saving Morty meant dying, and he was okay with that. This is not how normal Ricks behave. A normal Rick would save himself and let Morty die. A normal Rick would see Morty as replaceable. A normal Rick would think, well, this Morty is dead, but I can get another one at the Citadel. I just need to fill out some paperwork and they'll assign me a new Morty. No big deal. But our Rick doesn't think like that. Our Rick would rather die than let this specific Morty die. Why? What makes this Morty so special to Rick that Rick is willing to give up his own life? It's not like this Morty is different from other Mortys in any obvious way. He's not smarter or braver or more useful. If anything, he's pretty average as far as Mortys go. So why does Rick care so much about keeping this particular Morty alive? Throughout the series, we see other examples of Rick protecting Morty when he really doesn't have to. Rick goes out of his way to keep Morty safe. Rick gets genuinely upset when Morty is hurt or in danger. Rick makes decisions based on what's best for Morty, even when it costs Rick something. This isn't normal Rick behavior according to what we see from other Ricks. This is unusual. This is what makes Rick C137 a rogue. The Council of Ricks knows Rick C137 is too attached to his Morty. They comment on it. They notice it. When Evil Rick is downloading Rick's memories and sees images of Rick caring about Morty, Evil Rick mocks him for it. Evil Rick says that Ricks don't actually care about Mortys, that Morty is just camouflage. Evil Rick acts like Rick C137 is weak or stupid for having feelings about his grandson. But the mockery proves the point. Most Ricks don't care about their Mortys. Most Ricks would agree with Evil Rick that Mortys are just tools. The fact that Evil Rick feels the need to make fun of Rick C137 for caring means Rick C137 is unusual. His emotional attachment to Morty is weird by Rick standards. It's not normal Rick behavior. So why is Rick C137 like this? Why does he care when other Ricks don't? One possible explanation is that Rick C137 is just a better person than other Ricks. Maybe he has more humanity, more compassion, more love in his heart. Maybe despite being a genius scientist who's seen infinite universes, Rick still values family and connection. But the show doesn't really support this explanation. Rick C137 does terrible things constantly. He kills people without caring. He destroys entire civilizations for fun. He manipulates everyone around him. He's mean to his family. He's abusive to Morty in lots of ways. Rick isn't a good person. He's not more moral or compassionate than other Ricks. If anything, he might be worse than most Ricks when it comes to the horrible things he's willing to do. So if Rick isn't just naturally more caring, then why is he so attached to this specific Morty? The theory fans came up with was that Rick is overprotective because he lost a Morty before. Rick had an original Morty, his first grandson, and something happened to that Morty. Maybe that Morty died. Maybe Rick abandoned him like in the intro sequence. Maybe that Morty left Rick. However it ended, Rick lost his first Morty, and it hurt him badly. Now Rick has a second Morty, a replacement Morty from a different dimension, and Rick is determined not to lose this one too. Rick can't bring back his original Morty, but he can protect this new Morty. He can make sure this Morty doesn't die, or leave, or turn against him. He can be more careful this time. He can actually try to keep Morty safe instead of being careless and selfish. This would explain Rick's unusual behavior. Rick is overcompensating. He's trying to fix his past mistakes by being a better Rick to this Morty than he was to his first Morty. He sacrifices himself in a wrinkle in time because he couldn't save his original Morty, so he'll die before he lets this Morty die too. He's constantly protecting Morty because he failed to protect his first grandson. It would also explain why Rick drinks so much and seems so sad all the time. The show makes it clear that Rick is deeply depressed. Bird Person tells us that Rick's catchphrase, "Wubba lubba dub dub," means, "I am in great pain, please help me," in Bird Person's language. Rick is suffering constantly. He covers it up with jokes and anger and drinking, but underneath all that, Rick is in serious emotional pain. What's Rick in pain about? What hurt him so badly that he's been suffering for decades? Later in the series, we learn about Rick's wife Diane and his daughter Beth dying in his original dimension. That's definitely part of Rick's pain. But could there be more? Could Rick also be carrying guilt about what happened with his original Morty? Could he be haunted by memories of abandoning or losing his first grandson? Think about how Rick acts when Morty does become more independent and confident. Rick immediately tries to shut it down. Rick warns Morty about getting cocky. Rick erases Morty's memories to keep him dumb and scared. Rick does everything he can to prevent Morty from growing into a capable, confident person. Why? Because Rick is terrified of losing this Morty the same way he lost the first one. If Rick's original Morty got too smart and too confident and ended up leaving Rick or turning against Rick, then Rick would be desperate to prevent that from happening again. He'd keep this Morty dumb on purpose. He'd keep this Morty dependent on him. He'd do anything to make sure this relationship doesn't end the same way the first one did. The other Ricks at the Citadel don't have this baggage. They've never lost a Morty in a way that hurt them emotionally. They see Mortys as replaceable because they've always been able to replace them without caring. But Rick C137 knows what it feels like to lose a Morty and not be able to replace him. That first Morty was special somehow. That first Morty mattered, and Rick can't get him back. So Rick clings to this new Morty. He's overprotective, he's controlling, he's terrified of abandonment in both directions, scared that Morty will leave him or that he'll lose Morty. This fear drives Rick's behavior. It's why he's different from other Ricks. It's why he's a rogue. It's why the Council notices his attachment as unusual. All of this supports the theory that Rick had an original Morty before the Morty we watch in the show. The photos and memories show that Morty existed. The timeline contradiction proves that Morty wasn't our Morty. Rick's unusual emotional attachment suggests he's trying not to repeat past mistakes. Rick's warnings about cocky Mortys suggest he's seen what happens when a Morty gets too smart. Everything points to Rick having a history with a previous Morty, a history that ended badly. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But if all this evidence points to Rick having an original Morty, there's one huge problem that fans noticed. When Morty calls himself Morty C137, using Rick's dimension number as his own dimension, the other Ricks at the Citadel react strangely. They look at each other with confusion. They seem to know something Morty doesn't. Something about there being no such thing as Morty C137. Section 7. The Morty C137 that never existed. Throughout the series, Rick identifies himself as Rick C137. He says this multiple times across different episodes. When other characters ask Rick where he's from, he tells them Dimension C137. When Rick needs to identify himself to governments or other Ricks or anyone official, he uses C137 as his home dimension. This is just a fact about Rick. He's Rick Sanchez from Dimension C137. That's his name and address in the multiverse. Morty hears Rick use this label all the time. Morty sees Rick tell people he's from C137. So naturally, Morty starts thinking that he's also from Dimension C137. It makes sense from Morty's perspective. Rick is his grandfather, they live in the same house, they're from the same family. So if Rick is from C137, then Morty must be from C137 too, right? They're both from the same place. So Morty starts calling himself Morty C137. He uses this name when talking to other Mortys. He uses it when identifying himself to official organizations. He thinks this is his correct dimensional label, the same way Rick C137 is Rick's correct label. Morty doesn't know any better. Nobody told him he was wrong. Rick never corrected him. So Morty just keeps calling himself Morty C137, thinking that's who he is. In the episode Morty Night Run, we see Rick dropping Jerry off at this place called Jerry Baree. It's basically a daycare for Jerrys from different dimensions. Ricks can leave their Jerrys there while they go on adventures, and the Jerrys just hang out together, doing Jerry things until their Ricks come back to pick them up. When Rick checks Jerry in, he has to fill out paperwork identifying which dimension they're from. The form asks for Rick's home dimension. Rick writes C137. Then there's a space for Jerry's home dimension. Rick writes N/A, which means not applicable. Rick is saying that Jerry isn't from C137. Jerry is from somewhere else. This is a small detail that's easy to miss, but it's important. Rick knows that the people he lives with, his current family, aren't actually from his home dimension. He knows he's from C137, but they're not. Later, in the Season 3 premiere episode called The Rickshank Rickdemption, something really significant happens. Rick is in prison, and Morty and Summer go to the Citadel of Ricks to try to get help finding him. While they're at the Citadel, some Ricks from the Council grab them. These Ricks are suspicious about what Morty and Summer are doing there. One of the Ricks asks Morty which Rick he belongs to. Morty answers proudly that he's the Morty of Rick Sanchez from dimension C137. He says, "I'm Morty C137." And the moment he says this, something weird happens. Two of the Ricks look at each other. They don't say anything. They just exchange this glance, this look that says they both just heard something strange, or wrong, or surprising. Why would the Ricks react this way? Why would hearing Morty call himself C137 make them look at each other? It's not like Morty said something crazy or impossible. He just identified which Rick he belongs to. But clearly, something about Morty saying he's C137 caught their attention. Something about that statement didn't make sense to them. The show doesn't explain what this look means right away. The Ricks don't say, "Actually, Morty, you're not from C137. They don't correct him. They just share that glance and move on with the conversation. But fans noticed this moment immediately. Fans rewound and watched it again, trying to figure out what it meant. Why did the Ricks react that way? The most obvious explanation is that the Ricks know something Morty doesn't know. They know that Morty calling himself C137 is wrong somehow. They know there's no such thing as Morty C137, at least not naturally. And they're surprised to hear Morty use that label because it tells them something important about Morty and his Rick. Think about what the Council of Ricks would know. They're the government of Ricks. They keep track of dimensions and Ricks and Mortys across the multiverse. They have records. They have information about which dimensions have which versions of the Smith family. They would know what exists in dimension C137. They would know whether there's supposed to be a Morty there or not. And apparently, based on their reaction, there isn't supposed to be a Morty in dimension C137. At least not a Morty who naturally belongs there, as Rick C137's biological grandson. The Ricks know this. They know C137's history. They know what happened in that dimension. So when Morty says he's C137, they immediately know something is off about that claim. Rick C137 is famous among the Ricks. He's the rogue Rick, the terror Rick, the one who destroyed their government and rejected their society. The Council definitely has files on Rick C137. They've studied him, they know his background, they know his dimension's history. So they also know that there shouldn't be a Morty C137 running around calling himself by that dimension number. Later in the series, the show finally explains why there's no Morty C137. In Season 5, in an episode called Rick Mirai Jack, we learn the truth about Rick's actual origin. The show reveals that Rick C137 comes from a dimension where his wife Diane and his daughter Beth were killed when Beth was still a child. A different Rick, an evil Rick from another dimension, showed up and murdered Rick's family with a bomb. Young Beth died in that explosion. Diane died too. This is hugely important information. If Beth died as a child in dimension C137, then Beth never grew up. She never became an adult. She never went to high school. She never met Jerry. She never got pregnant at prom. She never had Summer. She never had Morty. None of that ever happened in dimension C137 because Beth died before any of it could happen. This means there's no such thing as Morty C137. There never was a Morty C137. There couldn't be because the Beth who would have been his mother died decades before Morty could have been born. Dimension C137 doesn't have a Summer or a Morty. It just has a Rick who lost his entire family and spent decades afterward hunting for the Rick who killed them. So when Morty calls himself Morty C137, He's using a label that doesn't actually exist. He's claiming to be from a dimension where he was never born. The Ricks at the Citadel know this. They know C137's history. They know Rick C137's family died. So they know this Morty standing in front of them can't actually be from C137, no matter what he says. This explains their reaction. They look at each other because Morty just revealed something without realizing it. Morty just told them that he doesn't know his own origin. He doesn't know he's not really from C137. He thinks he is because that's what Rick told him, or let him believe. This tells the Ricks that Rick C137 is lying to this Morty about where they're both from. Or at least, Rick is letting Morty believe something that isn't true. It also tells them that this Morty is traveling with Rick C137, even though Rick C137 never had a biological Morty of his own. This Morty must be from some other dimension. Rick must have picked up this Morty somewhere else, from a different dimension, and brought him along on adventures. The Morty doesn't know this. The Morty thinks he's Rick's real grandson from Rick's real dimension, but he's not. He's a Morty that Rick took from somewhere else. This fits perfectly with the theory about Rick having a previous Morty. If Rick C137 never had a biological Morty in his home dimension, but Rick has photos and memories of being with baby Morty, then those photos and memories must be from a different dimension. Rick must have gone to another dimension, found a Morty there, and spent time with that Morty. That would be Rick's original Morty, the first Morty he adventured with, the one in the photos. Then something happened to separate Rick from that first Morty. We don't know what yet, but somehow Rick lost his original Morty. So Rick went looking for a replacement. He found a dimension where a Rick had abandoned his family and never come back. Rick stepped into that absent Rick's place, pretending to be the Rick who belonged there. He took over that Rick's life and claimed that Rick's family, including that Rick's Morty. Our Morty, the one we watch in the show, is actually from this other dimension. He's not from C137. He's from whatever dimension Rick found when he went looking for a new family. The show later reveals this dimension is called the Prime dimension, but Morty doesn't know that. Morty thinks he's from C137 because he assumes he's from the same place as Rick, but he's wrong. Rick knows Morty is wrong. Rick knows exactly which dimension he came from and which dimension Morty came from, and he knows they're different. But Rick never corrects Morty. Rick lets Morty keep calling himself Morty C137 even though it's not true. Why? Maybe because it's easier than explaining the truth. Maybe because Rick doesn't want Morty to know that Rick isn't actually his original grandfather. Maybe because the truth is too complicated and painful. The Ricks at the Citadel figure this out instantly when Morty uses the C137 label. They know Rick C137's history. They know there's no Morty C137. So they know Rick must have picked up this Morty from somewhere else. They probably guess that Rick is replacing himself in another dimension, living with another Rick's family, pretending to be someone he's not. This is exactly the kind of thing Rick C137 would do. It fits his rogue status, his willingness to break rules and do whatever benefits him. What the Ricks don't know, and what we're theorizing, is that this isn't Rick's first time doing this. This isn't Rick's first replacement Morty. Rick had another Morty before, from yet another dimension. Rick spent years with that first Morty, long enough to have photos and memories. Then, something happened to that first Morty. And eventually, Rick ended up in this current dimension with this current Morty, starting over again with a new family. The fact that there's no naturally existing Morty C137 actually supports the theory about Rick having an original Morty from somewhere else. It proves that Rick's first Morty, the one in the photos, couldn't have been from C137. That Morty had to be from a different dimension where Beth survived and grew up and had kids. Rick must have gone to that other dimension at some point and been part of that Morty's life during infancy. So we have Rick from C137, where his family died. We have an unknown dimension where Rick's first Morty lived, the one from the photos. And we have the Prime dimension where our current Morty lives. 3 different dimensions, all connected through Rick's journey across the multiverse. All part of the complicated history Rick is hiding from everyone. Morty has no idea about any of this. Morty thinks he's Morty C137, grandson of Rick C137, from the same dimension as his grandfather. He doesn't know his grandfather is from a dimension where Morty never existed. He doesn't know Rick came from somewhere else and inserted himself into this family. He doesn't know he might not be Rick's first Morty. Morty just lives his life, calling himself C137, completely unaware that the Ricks who hear him say that know he's wrong. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But if Rick has been through multiple Mortys, if Rick has replaced Mortys before, that raises another question. How many times has Rick done this? Is our Morty the second Morty? The third? Is there a whole string of Mortys that Rick has gone through over the years? The show gives us a clue about this in an episode where Rick casually accepts something that most people would find horrifying. Section 8. The Morty Replacement Voucher. At the end of close Rick counters of the Rick kind, after all the chaos with evil Rick is over and the captured Mortys are rescued, the Council of Ricks talks to Rick C137. They're grateful that he helped solve the case, even though they had arrested him for it at first. They want to make things right. They want to compensate Rick for the trouble they caused him by accusing him of crimes he didn't commit. So the council offers Rick something. They give him a voucher. Not a voucher for money or for a free vacation or for anything normal. They give him a voucher for a free replacement Morty. They're literally handing Rick a piece of paper that he can use to get a new Morty if his current one dies or gets too damaged to be useful anymore. It's like a coupon, but instead of getting a free sandwich, Rick gets a free grandson. Here's what's shocking about this moment. Rick takes the voucher. He doesn't look confused about what it is. He doesn't ask questions about how it works. He doesn't seem surprised that such a thing exists. Rick just accepts the voucher like it's a normal thing to receive, like someone just handed him a business card or a flyer. He takes it, presumably puts it in his pocket, and that's that. The scene moves on. Think about what this means. The Council of Ricks has an official system for replacing Mortys. They have vouchers printed up. They hand them out as compensation or rewards. This is a regular enough thing that they have paperwork for it. And Rick knows about this system. Rick isn't surprised by it. Rick understands immediately what the voucher is for and accepts it without any questions. How does Rick know about the Morty replacement system? Has he used it before? Has he gotten replacement Mortys in the past? The show doesn't directly tell us, but Rick's reaction suggests this isn't his first time hearing about Morty vouchers. He's familiar with the concept. He knows what the Citadel offers and how it works. Most people, if handed a voucher for a replacement family member, would be horrified. They'd refuse it. They'd be insulted. What do you mean replacement? My grandson isn't a thing you can just swap out. He's a person. He's my family. I don't want a replacement. That would be the normal reaction. But Rick doesn't react that way. Rick just takes the voucher like it's a useful thing to have. This tells us something important about how Rick views Mortys. Despite caring about his current Morty more than most Ricks care about theirs, Rick still sees Mortys as somewhat replaceable. He still understands the logic of getting a new one if the old one is gone. He still accepts that in the multiverse, with infinite Mortys available, you can always find another one if you need to. But there's more evidence that Rick has experience replacing Mortys, and it comes way earlier in the series. In Rick Potion number 9, which is only the 6th episode of the whole show, Rick and Morty completely destroy their entire dimension. Rick makes a love potion for Morty to use on his crush Jessica. The potion works, but then it spreads. It infects everyone. Then it mutates. Soon, everyone on Earth, except Rick, Morty, Summer, Beth, and Jerry, has turned into horrifying monsters. Rick tries to fix it. He really does try. He makes a cure and spreads it across the planet. But the cure makes things worse. Now, instead of lovesick monsters, everyone turns into even more disgusting creatures. Rick tries again. He makes another cure. But that one backfires too. Now everyone on Earth is these horrible Cronenberg-style monsters, named after the filmmaker who makes movies with disturbing body horror. Rick admits he can't fix it. The damage is permanent. Their entire world is ruined. Everyone they know is a monster. Their dimension is basically destroyed. This is a massive catastrophe. Morty is devastated. He starts crying. He's 14 years old and his entire world just ended. Everything and everyone he's ever known is gone. But Rick already has a solution. Rick pulls out his portal gun and starts scanning through dimensions, looking for something specific. He's searching for a dimension where everything went right, where a different Rick found a cure that worked, where that dimension's Earth is back to normal. And Rick finds one. He finds a dimension where that Rick successfully cured the Cronenberg problem and saved the world. But there's a catch. That successful Rick and that Rick's Morty died right after saving the world. They were celebrating in their garage, and one of Rick's inventions exploded and killed them both instantly. So now that dimension has a perfectly normal Earth, but it doesn't have a Rick and Morty anymore. They're dead. Their bodies are right there in the garage where they died. Rick sees this as an opportunity. He grabs Morty and they jump through a portal into this new dimension. They arrive in the garage where the other Rick and Morty just died. Rick immediately starts digging in the backyard. He's making graves. He's going to bury these dead versions of themselves. And then Rick and Morty will just take over their lives. They'll pretend to be the Rick and Morty who lived in this dimension. The family will never know the difference. Morty is completely traumatized by this. He has to bury his own dead body. He has to dig a grave and drag a corpse that looks exactly like him into it and cover it with dirt. He's crying and shaking and terrified. This is the worst thing that's ever happened to him. He can't believe this is real. He can't believe Rick is making him do this. But Rick acts like it's no big deal. Rick digs his grave efficiently, like he's done this before. Rick knows exactly where to bury the bodies so they won't be found. Rick knows how deep to dig. Rick knows how to cover their tracks. Rick moves through this process smoothly, without hesitation, without emotion. It's routine for him. It's just another problem that needs solving. And here's the thing that fans noticed. Rick is too good at this. Rick is too comfortable with abandoning his entire dimension and replacing himself in a new one. Normal people, even genius scientists, would struggle with this. They'd be upset about leaving their world behind. They'd have moral problems with stealing someone else's life. They'd at least be a little bit disturbed by burying their own corpse. But Rick isn't disturbed at all. Rick acts like he's done this exact thing before. Like he's practiced at finding dimensions where he can slot himself in. Like he's familiar with the process of becoming someone else's Rick and taking over their life. The ease with which Rick does this suggests it's not his first time. In the episode, Rick tells Morty that they can only do this a few times. He says they can probably replace themselves 3 or 4 times maximum before it gets too complicated. This is a weird thing to say if Rick has never done it before. How does Rick know they can do it 3 or 4 times? How does Rick know what the limit is, unless he's already done it at least once or twice before and knows from experience how many times it works? Morty asks, "Oh great, we can only do this 3 or 4 more times?" And Rick says, yes, that's about the limit. Notice Morty says more times, implying this current time might not be the first, and Rick doesn't correct him. Rick doesn't say, "No, Morty, this is our first time doing this, we can do it 3 or 4 total." Rick says they can do it 3 or 4 more times, which suggests they might have already used up 1 or 2 of their chances. This connects to the theory about Rick having an original Morty before our Morty. If Rick spent years with a first Morty from a different dimension, and then something happened to that Morty, Rick would need to find a replacement. Rick would need to jump to a new dimension and find a new Morty to travel with. And maybe Rick has done this replacement process multiple times over the decades. Maybe our Morty isn't even Rick's second Morty. Maybe he's the 3rd or 4th. Maybe Rick has been through several Mortys over the years, always replacing them when something goes wrong, always finding new dimensions where he can start over. That would explain why Rick is so good at it. That would explain why Rick knows exactly how many times they can do it. That would explain Rick's casual acceptance of the Morty replacement voucher. The Citadel's entire system is built around the idea that Mortys can and should be replaced regularly. In the Ricklantis mix-up, we see inside the Citadel's Morty facilities. There are Mortys being manufactured in labs. There are Mortys waiting in holding areas to be assigned to Ricks. There are Mortys being trained for specific jobs. The whole place treats Mortys like products on an assembly line. We see a scene where Mortys are being sorted and assigned. A worker is matching Mortys to Ricks based on compatibility. Some Mortys get assigned to Ricks who will treat them okay. Some Mortys get assigned to Ricks who will be terrible to them. The Mortys have no choice in this. They just get told which Rick they belong to now, and they have to go with that Rick whether they want to or not. This system exists because Mortys die or get damaged all the time. Ricks go on dangerous adventures. Mortys get killed. Mortys get traumatized beyond usefulness. Mortys run away. Mortys get left behind. Whatever the reason, Ricks need new Mortys frequently enough that the Citadel built an entire industry around providing them. There are jobs dedicated to Morty production and Morty assignment. There's a whole economy based on Mortys being disposable and replaceable. Rick C137 knows about this system. Rick has been to the Citadel. Rick understands how it works. And Rick accepts a voucher to use it, which means Rick is willing to participate in this system if necessary. Despite caring more about his current Morty than most Ricks do, Rick still sees Morties as things that can be swapped out when needed. This is dark, but it fits with everything we know about Rick. Rick has done terrible things. Rick has made horrible choices. Rick has hurt people he claims to care about. Rick loving Morty more than other Ricks love their Morties doesn't mean Rick sees Morty as truly irreplaceable. It just means Rick would be sad if this Morty died or left, and Rick would try harder to prevent it. But if it happened anyway, Rick would eventually get a replacement. The question is, how many times has Rick already done this? How many Mortys have there been before our Morty? The show doesn't give us a clear answer, but the evidence suggests it's happened before. The photos of baby Morty prove Rick has been around a different Morty in the past. Rick's comfort with dimension hopping and identity swapping proves he's practiced at it. Rick's acceptance of the voucher proves he's familiar with the Morty replacement system. So maybe there was an original Morty. The first one, the one from the photos, the one Rick spent the most time with. Then something happened to that Morty. Rick needed a replacement. Maybe Rick went to the Citadel and used their system. Maybe Rick found a dimension on his own, like he did in Rick Potion number 9. Either way, Rick got a new Morty and continued his adventures. And maybe that second Morty didn't last either. Maybe there was a third, a fourth. Maybe Rick has been through multiple Mortys over the years, always replacing them when they die or leave or turn against him, until finally Rick ended up in the current dimension with the current Morty, the one we watch in the show. And Rick is trying really hard to make this one last, because he's tired of losing Mortys. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But if Evil Morty really is Rick's first Morty, if a theory is true, then something different happened with that one. That Morty didn't die. That Morty didn't get lost. That Morty survived whatever separated him from Rick. And that Morty became something Rick never expected. He became smart. Smart enough to do things that no normal Morty should be able to do. Section 9. Evil Morty's genius-level intelligence. In the Rick and Morty universe, Mortys are supposed to be dumb. That's the whole point of them. The show explains this clearly in multiple episodes. Mortys exist to hide Rick's genius brainwaves with their stupid brainwaves. A Morty's brain is so simple, so basic, so lacking in intelligence, that when a Rick and Morty are together, the Morty's dumb thoughts cancel out the Rick's smart thoughts. This makes Rick invisible to scanners that look for genius-level brain activity. For this system to work, Mortys have to stay dumb. If a Morty gets smarter, his brainwaves change. The camouflage stops working. So the entire multiverse operates on the assumption that Mortys are and will always be stupid. Ricks don't worry about their Mortys becoming smart because it's not supposed to be possible. Mortys are just naturally not very bright. We see this throughout the show. Most Mortys struggle in school. They have trouble understanding basic concepts. They make bad decisions. They panic in dangerous situations. They trust people they shouldn't trust. They fall for obvious tricks. The Mortys we meet at the Citadel aren't criminal masterminds or genius inventors. They're kids who work boring jobs and follow orders and don't ask too many questions. Our Morty fits this pattern at the start of the series. In early episodes, Morty is clearly not smart. He gets bad grades, he can't figure out Rick's technology, he messes up simple tasks, he asks dumb questions. Rick constantly reminds Morty how stupid he is. And Morty doesn't really argue because he kind of knows it's true. Morty accepts that he's not the smart one. Rick is the smart one. That's how their relationship works. But then we meet Evil Morty. And everything we think we know about Mortys gets challenged. Because Evil Morty isn't dumb at all. Evil Morty is incredibly, impossibly, frighteningly intelligent. He might be as smart as Rick himself, maybe even smarter in some ways. Let's look at what Evil Morty accomplishes in just his first appearance. He builds technology that can control another person's brain remotely. Not just control their body, but actually override their thoughts and actions completely. The person being controlled can't resist. They can't fight back. They become a puppet. And Evil Morty is pulling the strings. This is insanely advanced technology. Rick is supposed to be the smartest person in the universe, and even Rick doesn't casually throw around mind control devices. Mind control shows up in the series, but it's always treated as difficult, dangerous, cutting-edge science. It's not something you just whip up in an afternoon. It requires deep understanding of neuroscience, cybernetics, programming, and probably a dozen other fields. Evil Morty built this technology as a 14-year-old kid. Or at least, he looks 14. We don't know his exact age, but he appears to be around the same age as our Morty. And he created technology that can completely control a Rick. Not just any person, but specifically a Rick. A genius scientist with the smartest brain in the universe. Evil Morty figured out how to hack into that brain and take it over. Think about how hard that would be. Rick's brain is complicated. Rick knows science that most people can't even imagine. Rick has probably built defenses against mind control, ways to protect himself from exactly this kind of attack. But Evil Morty broke through all of that. He cracked Rick's brain like it was a locked door, and he had the key. The cybernetic implants Evil Morty built aren't simple either. We see them when the Council examines Evil Rick's body after he dies. There are receivers in his brain, connected to his nervous system, integrated with his thoughts. This is precise, delicate work. One mistake and you'd kill the person you're trying to control, or damage their brains so badly they become useless. But Evil Morty's implants worked perfectly. His Rick was completely under his control, and still fully functional as a genius scientist. Evil Morty also built an entire secret base, a facility large enough to hold hundreds of captured Mortys, with torture devices, cloaking technology, security systems, and everything else needed to run a major operation. He designed a system where the pain from tortured Mortys creates brainwaves that hide his location from the Citadel. This is using Mortys as camouflage, but in reverse. Instead of hiding Rick's smart brain with Morty's dumb brain, he's hiding his entire base with the confused, panicked brainwaves of tortured Mortys. That's a sophisticated understanding of how brainwave detection works. Evil Morty didn't just copy something Rick invented. He came up with his own application of the science, his own way of using it. He thought creatively about the problem and invented a solution that even Rick hadn't thought of. Then there's the hacking. Evil Morty remotely hacked Rick C137's portal gun. Portal guns are the most advanced technology in the entire show. They create holes in reality that let you travel between dimensions instantly. They require understanding physics that goes way beyond what normal humans even know exists. Ricks can build them because Ricks are geniuses. Nobody else can make portal guns because nobody else is smart enough. But Evil Morty hacked one from a distance, without Rick noticing. He broke into the portal gun's systems, uploaded fake travel data, and made it look real enough to fool the Council of Ricks. The Council is made up of thousands of Ricks, all of them geniuses. They examined the evidence and believed it. Evil Morty's hack was so good that genius scientists couldn't tell it was fake. How does a Morty, who's supposed to be dumb, learn how to hack the most advanced technology in the multiverse? How does he even understand how portal guns work, let alone figure out how to break into one and change its data? This isn't something you can just stumble into. This requires deep knowledge, careful study, and incredible intelligence. Evil Morty also built a device to download Rick's brain. When he captures Rick C137, he hooks him up to a machine that copies everything in Rick's mind. Every memory, every piece of knowledge, every secret Rick has ever had. This machine can read a Rick's brain completely and transfer all that information somewhere else. Again, this is technology that shouldn't exist outside of Rick's own inventions. Ricks are protective of their knowledge. They don't share their best inventions with others. They definitely don't share them with Mortys. But Evil Morty either invented this brain downloading machine himself, or he stole the plans from somewhere and built it perfectly. Either way, it shows incredible technical skill. Then, Evil Morty does something even more impressive. He infiltrates the Citadel of Ricks and becomes president. He creates a fake identity as Candidate Morty. He runs a political campaign. He gives speeches that convince thousands of Mortys, and even some Ricks, to vote for him. He wins the election and takes control of the most powerful organization in the multiverse. This requires more than just technical intelligence. This requires social intelligence, political intelligence, strategic thinking. Evil Morty had to understand how the Citadel works, how its government functions, what the citizens want, how to manipulate their emotions and opinions. He had to present himself as trustworthy while secretly planning to destroy everything. During his campaign, Evil Morty gives a speech at a debate that completely changes the race. He talks about how the Citadel has a class system, where Ricks are on top and Mortys are on the bottom. He talks about how Mortys deserve better. He sounds passionate and genuine and inspiring. The crowd loves it. Mortys who thought they had no voice suddenly see someone fighting for them. But it's all a lie. Evil Morty doesn't actually care about helping Mortys. He just needs them to vote for him. He's manipulating them, using their pain and frustration to gain power. And it works perfectly. He understands psychology well enough to know exactly what to say to win people over. That's a different kind of intelligence than building machines, but it's just as impressive. Once Evil Morty becomes president, he immediately starts executing his real plan. He kills everyone on the Shadow Council of Ricks, the secret group that actually runs the Citadel. He takes complete control. He hacks every portal gun in the entire Citadel and redirects them so anyone trying to escape gets sent to a fatal location. He reprograms all the Operation Phoenix clones, which are backup bodies Ricks use to resurrect themselves, and uses them as fuel for his escape. This is mass murder on a huge scale. Thousands of Ricks and Mortys die in Evil Morty's plan, and he pulls it off flawlessly. He planned every detail. He knew which systems to hack, which people to kill, which resources to steal. He turned the entire Citadel into a giant machine for his escape, and nobody could stop him. The escape itself is Evil Morty's greatest achievement. He discovers that the multiverse has a barrier called the Central Finite Curve. This barrier separates universes where Rick is the smartest person from universes where he isn't. All Ricks and Mortys are trapped inside this curve, unable to access the wider multiverse beyond it. Evil Morty not only discovers this barrier exists, he figures out how to break through it. He uses the Citadel's dimensional drive, overcharges it with the blood and bodies of dead Ricks and Mortys, and punches a hole straight through the curve. He escapes into the greater multiverse where Ricks have no power. He does something that was supposed to be impossible. Then, he builds his own portal gun. Not a regular green portal gun like Rick uses, but a golden portal gun that can travel outside the curve. This portal gun uses different technology because it has to work in parts of the multiverse where Rick's portal guns don't function. Evil Morty invented a completely new type of interdimensional travel device. No other Morty in the entire series shows this level of intelligence. No other Morty invents technology. No other Morty hacks systems. No other Morty leads revolutions or escapes impossible traps. Evil Morty stands alone as the only Morty who can match Rick's genius. So how did Evil Morty get this smart? Mortys are supposed to be dumb. That's their biological function in the multiverse. But Evil Morty is clearly not normal. Something made him different. Something gave him knowledge and skills that Mortys shouldn't have. The most logical explanation is that someone taught him. Someone showed Evil Morty how science works, how technology functions, how to build and hack and invent. Someone gave Evil Morty the education that turned him from a normal dumb Morty into a super genius. Who could teach a Morty that much? Who has the knowledge to turn someone into a Rick-level genius? The answer is obvious. A Rick could do it. Specifically, Rick C137 could do it. If Evil Morty is Rick's original Morty, if they spent years together going on adventures, then Rick would have been teaching Evil Morty constantly. Not on purpose maybe, but just through exposure. Morty would see Rick building things. He'd watch Rick solve problems. He'd ask questions and Rick would answer them. Over time, over hundreds or thousands of adventures, Morty would learn. We see this happening with our Morty too. In early seasons, Morty can barely work Rick's gadgets. By later seasons, Morty knows how to use most of Rick's devices. He understands the basics of how they function, he can sometimes fix them or modify them. Morty is slowly getting smarter just from being around Rick and paying attention. Now imagine that process happening over a much longer time. Imagine a Morty who spent his whole childhood with Rick, from infancy through teenage years. That Morty would absorb massive amounts of knowledge. He'd become capable with technology. He'd start understanding Rick's science. He'd grow from a dumb kid into someone genuinely intelligent. And if that Morty ever turned against Rick, if he ever decided to use everything Rick taught him against Rick himself, he'd be incredibly dangerous. He'd know Rick's tricks. He'd understand Rick's technology. He'd be able to think like Rick, predict what Rick would do, counter Rick's plans. He'd be the perfect enemy because Rick created him. This explains Evil Morty's intelligence. Rick trained him without meaning to. Rick spent years teaching his original Morty, making him smarter, showing him how things work. Then something went wrong between them. That Morty left, or was abandoned, or something else terrible happened. And that Morty took all the knowledge Rick gave him and used it to become Evil Morty. It also explains why Rick warns about cocky Mortys being dangerous. Rick knows from experience what happens when a Morty gets too smart. Rick created Evil Morty by being around him too long, by teaching him too much, by letting him become confident and capable. Rick's biggest enemy isn't another Rick. It's a Morty who learned from Rick and turned against him. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But if Evil Morty learned all this from Rick, if they have this deep history together, that raises an important question. How did Evil Morty know about the central finite curve? How did he know this cosmic secret that even most Ricks don't fully understand? And why did he need to download Rick C137's brain specifically to escape it? Section 10. The Central Finite Curve Revelation. In the Season 5 finale, an episode called Rick Mirai Jack, Evil Morty returns after being absent from the show for years. He's now the president of the Citadel, and he's ready to execute the plan he's been working toward all along. Rick C137 and Morty end up at the Citadel right as Evil Morty is about to make his move. They walk into the biggest revelation of the entire series. Evil Morty captures them and sits them down for dinner. This is a weird moment because Evil Morty isn't immediately violent or threatening. He's calm. He's casual. He talks to them like he's explaining something they should have figured out already. And what he explains changes everything we thought we knew about the multiverse. Evil Morty tells them about the central finite curve. This is the first time the show fully explains what it is. The central finite curve is a barrier that divides the infinite multiverse into two parts. On one side of the barrier are all the universes where Rick Sanchez is the smartest person alive. On the other side are all the universes where Rick isn't the smartest, where someone else is smarter than him, where Rick might not even exist at all. The Ricks built this barrier themselves, trapping everyone inside it. They took infinite realities and walled off only the ones where they're guaranteed to be the most intelligent beings. Then they locked the barrier so nobody could get out or see what's beyond it. Every Rick, every Morty, every version of the Smith family that we've seen in the show exists inside this curve. They're all trapped in a section of the multiverse specifically designed to keep Rick on top. Evil Morty describes it perfectly. He says the Ricks built a wall around infinity. They separated all the infinite universes from all the infinite universes where Rick is the smartest man in the universe. Then he says something that hits really hard. He tells Morty that every version of them has spent every version of all their lives in one infinite crib built around one infinite baby. The baby is Rick. The crib is the central finite curve, and everyone inside it exists only to make Rick feel important. This is a massive revelation, but here's what's interesting for our theory. How did Evil Morty know about this? The central finite curve is a secret. Most Ricks don't even fully understand it. Most Mortys have no idea it exists. The show makes it clear that this information is hidden, that the Citadel keeps it quiet. So how did Evil Morty, a 14-year-old Morty, discover the biggest secret in the multiverse? Evil Morty explains that he found out by downloading Rick C137's brain. Back in his first appearance, when Evil Morty captured Rick and hooked him up to that brain scanning machine, Evil Morty wasn't just looking for random information. He was specifically searching for knowledge about the Citadel and the central finite curve. He knew that Rick C137's brain would have this information. He knew Rick C137 was the key to understanding the curve and how to escape it. But why? Why would Evil Morty assume Rick C137 specifically knows about the central finite curve? There are infinite Ricks. Why target this one particular Rick's brain for this information? The show gives us the answer. Rick C137 didn't just know about the central finite curve. Rick C137 helped create it. The episode reveals Rick C137's full backstory. We see his wife Diane and daughter Beth killed by another Rick. We see Rick C137 become obsessed with finding the Rick who killed his family. We see him invent the portal gun and travel across dimensions hunting for his family's murderer. And we see him eventually giving up the hunt and helping other Ricks build the Citadel and the central finite curve. Rick C137 was one of the original architects of this prison. He helped design the barrier that traps everyone inside these specific dimensions. He worked with the Council of Ricks to build the whole system. Then later, Rick got disgusted with what the Citadel became and abandoned it. He rejected the organization he helped create. But his knowledge of how it was built, how it functions, how its dimensional drive works, all of that stayed in his brain. Evil Morty needed that knowledge. To escape the central finite curve, Evil Morty had to understand exactly how it was constructed. He needed the technical details, the blueprints, the science behind it. And those details existed in Rick C137's head because Rick C137 was there when it was built. This is why Evil Morty specifically targeted Rick C137 in his first appearance. Not because of random chance. Not because Rick C137 just happened to be convenient, but because Rick C137 was one of the only Ricks who had the complete information Evil Morty needed. Evil Morty's entire plan from the very beginning was to get Rick C137's brain, extract this specific knowledge, and use it to escape. Think about what this means. Evil Morty knew that Rick C137 helped build the central finite curve. He knew that Rick C137 would have the information he needed. How did Evil Morty know this? The Citadel keeps its history secret. The fact that Rick C137 helped create the curve and then abandoned the Citadel isn't public knowledge. It's not something a random Morty would just hear about and know. But what if Evil Morty learned it directly from Rick? What if Rick C137 told him? If Evil Morty is Rick's original Morty, if they spent years together before Evil Morty turned against him, then Rick might have shared this information. Maybe not all the details, but enough for Evil Morty to know that Rick was involved in creating the Citadel and the curve. Rick might have mentioned his past while drunk. He might have told stories about the old days when he and other Ricks built something important. He might have complained about the Citadel and how it used to be different. Over years of adventures, Rick might have dropped enough hints for Evil Morty to piece together that Rick C137 was one of the original builders. Or maybe Evil Morty figured it out another way. Maybe he noticed how other Ricks treated Rick C137, how they called him a rogue, how they seemed to know his history. Maybe he investigated Rick's past and discovered his connection to the Citadel's founding. Either way, Evil Morty specifically knew to go after Rick C137 for this information, which suggests a deep understanding of Rick C137's personal history. The way Evil Morty talks to Rick and Morty during their dinner is also interesting. He's not just explaining his plan like a typical villain. He's making it personal. He talks directly to Morty Prime about what it's like being Rick's grandson. He explains how Mortys are trapped, how they exist only to serve Ricks, how every Morty who's ever been sick of Rick has been an evil Morty. This speech feels personal. Evil Morty isn't talking about Ricks in general as abstract figures he dislikes. He's talking about what it's like to be a Morty, specifically connected to a Rick. He's describing the experience of being controlled, manipulated, and used by someone who claims to care about you. This sounds like someone speaking from direct experience with a specific Rick. When Evil Morty says, "That's what makes me evil, being sick of him," he's talking about Rick. Not Ricks plural, him. One specific Rick. The Rick who made Evil Morty sick of everything. The Rick who Evil Morty is escaping from. And given that Evil Morty's entire plan revolves around Rick C137's brain, around Rick C137's knowledge, around things Rick C137 specifically did, it seems like Rick C137 is that Rick. Throughout this whole episode, Evil Morty keeps focusing on Rick C137. Even though there are thousands of Ricks at the Citadel, even though Evil Morty is killing hundreds of them to fuel his escape, his attention keeps coming back to Rick C137. He scanned Rick C137's brain years ago. He used Rick C137's knowledge to become president. He's using Rick C137's secrets to break the curve. Everything Evil Morty accomplished comes from specifically targeting Rick C137. That's not random. That's not coincidence. That's a focused, personal campaign against one particular Rick. A Rick who Evil Morty seems to know extremely well. A Rick whose history Evil Morty understands. A Rick whose knowledge Evil Morty needed above all others. At the end of the episode, after Evil Morty successfully breaks through the central finite curve, he offers Morty Prime a chance to escape with him. He opens his small spaceship, and there's one seat. Well, a seat and a toilet, as Evil Morty jokes. He tells Morty that he can come, that he can leave Rick and all of this behind, that he can be free. Morty refuses. Morty chooses to stay with Rick. And Evil Morty seems to expect this. He's not surprised or disappointed. He anticipated that Morty would choose Rick over freedom. This suggests Evil Morty understands how the Rick-Morty relationship works from experience. He knows how hard it is to leave Rick, how much Mortys are conditioned to stay loyal even when they shouldn't. Evil Morty escapes through his golden portal into the greater multiverse beyond the curve. He's finally free of Rick and everything Rick represents. He achieved his goal. But his goal was specifically about escaping Rick C137's creation, Rick C137's prison, Rick C137's world. Everything about Evil Morty's plan was about getting away from Rick C137. For years, this all seemed to support the theory that Evil Morty was Rick C137's original Morty. The personal vendetta, the specific knowledge of Rick's history, the focus on Rick C137 above all other Ricks, the understanding of what it's like to be Rick's Morty. All of it pointed toward a previous relationship between Evil Morty and Rick C137, a relationship that went bad, a relationship that turned Evil Morty into who he is. The theory seemed to explain everything. Rick's photos and memories of a baby Morty were of Evil Morty when he was young. Rick and Evil Morty adventured together for years. Evil Morty learned from Rick and got too smart. Something terrible happened between them. Maybe Rick abandoned him like in the intro sequence. Evil Morty survived and spent years planning revenge. He specifically targeted Rick C137 because Rick C137 was his Rick. And Evil Morty's ultimate revenge was using Rick's own knowledge against him to escape Rick's world completely. Thousands of fans believed this theory. It made perfect sense with all the evidence. The timeline problems, the photos, Evil Morty's intelligence, his focus on Rick C137, his knowledge of the central finite curve, everything fit together into one complete story about Rick losing his original Morty, and that Morty becoming his greatest enemy. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But theories are just theories until the show confirms them. And when the show finally revealed the full truth about Rick's past and Evil Morty's origin, it wasn't quite what anyone expected. The real story turned out to be both simpler and somehow even darker than the theory suggested. Section 11. The canonical debunking. For years, fans believed they had figured out Evil Morty's secret. The theory was clean, logical, and explained everything. Evil Morty was Rick C137's original Morty from before the show started. Rick abandoned him or lost him somehow. Evil Morty survived and spent years planning revenge. That's why he specifically targeted Rick C137. That's why he was so smart. That's why he knew Rick's secrets. The theory made perfect sense with all the evidence. Then Season 5 came out, and the show revealed something that completely destroyed this theory. In the episode Rick Mirai Jack, the same episode where Evil Morty escapes the central finite curve, we finally see Rick C137's real backstory. Not a fake memory like he showed the Galactic Federation, not hints or pieces. The whole truth about where Rick C137 actually came from. The episode shows us a younger Rick living a normal life. He has a wife named Diane and a young daughter named Beth. They're happy. Rick is just a regular dad, not a genius scientist traveling through dimensions. He's content with his simple life. Then, one day, another Rick appears in his garage. This other Rick offers to share portal technology with him, to show him the multiverse, to give him infinite adventures. But Rick C137 says no. He tells this other Rick that he doesn't want that life. He'd rather stay with his family. The other Rick gets angry at this rejection. He tells Rick C137 he'll regret this choice. Then, the other Rick does something terrible. He drops a bomb into Rick's garage and opens a portal to escape. The bomb explodes, killing Diane and Beth instantly. Rick C137 survives, but his entire family is gone. This is the real origin of Rick C137. His wife and daughter were murdered right in front of him when Beth was still a child. The show confirms this actually happened. It's not a made-up memory. This is the truth about Rick's past. Here's why this completely destroys the theory about Evil Morty being Rick's original Morty. If Beth died as a child in dimension C137, then Beth never grew up. She never became an adult. She never went to high school. She never met Jerry at prom. She never got pregnant. She never had Summer. She never had Morty. There is no Morty in dimension C137. There never was. There couldn't be, because the woman who would have been his mother died decades before he could have been born. Dimension C137 doesn't have a Summer or a Morty. It just has a Rick who lost everything and spent years hunting for the Rick who killed his family. This means Rick C137 never had an original Morty from his home dimension. The baby Morty in those photos and memories can't be from C137 because no Morty ever existed there. The theory that Evil Morty was Rick's first Morty from C137 is impossible. It can't be true according to the show's own established facts. The episode Solarix, which comes after this revelation, confirms these details. Rick returns to dimension C137, and we see that he kept the entire dimension frozen in time on the day he lost his family. The dimension has been in a loop for decades, with the same day repeating over and over. Rick eventually releases the time loop, letting everyone there finally move forward or die. But the important part is that dimension C137 is confirmed to be the place where Rick's family died, where no grandchildren were ever born. So if Rick C137 never had a biological Morty from his own dimension, where did those photos and memories come from? The show doesn't give us a complete answer, but we can piece together what probably happened. After his family died, Rick C137 spent years traveling the multiverse, hunting for the Rick who killed them. During this time, he would have visited many dimensions, seen many versions of his family alive in other universes. Rick eventually found the dimension where the killer Rick lived. That dimension is called the Prime dimension, and it's where our current Morty comes from. The Rick from that dimension, called Rick Prime, was the one who killed Rick C137's family. Rick C137 moved into Prime's dimension, replacing him, hoping Rick Prime would eventually return so Rick C137 could kill him in revenge. By the time Rick C137 arrived in the Prime dimension, Morty had already been born. This is the Morty we watch in the show. Rick C137 showed up when this Morty was around 13 years old, pretending to be the Rick who belonged to that family. Beth thought Rick was her father returning after 20 years. She had no idea this was a completely different Rick from a different dimension. So our Morty isn't Rick C137's biological grandson at all. He's Rick Prime's biological grandson. Rick C137 just stepped into Rick Prime's life and took over. This explains the timeline contradiction. Rick wasn't actually gone for 20 years from Morty's life. Rick Prime was gone for 20 years. Rick C137 only showed up recently, right before the series started. The photos and memories of baby Morty are harder to explain. The show doesn't directly address them after revealing Rick's backstory, but there are a few possibilities. The photos might show a different Rick with a different Morty, not Rick C137 at all. Maybe Bird Person had photos of various Ricks he knew over the years, and we assumed they were all Rick C137. Or the memories could be false memories, things Rick's brain created or adopted from other Ricks he encountered. When Rick was hunting Rick Prime across dimensions, he would have seen versions of himself with baby Mortys in other universes. His brain might have absorbed those images and stored them as if they were his own memories. The memory scan in Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind shows us what's in Rick's head, but that doesn't mean everything in there is a real memory of things Rick actually experienced. Or, and this is probably the most likely explanation, the show deliberately included those photos and memories to mislead us. The writers wanted us to think Rick had a previous Morty. They wanted us to build theories and ask questions. They planted evidence that seemed to point one way, knowing they'd eventually reveal the truth that pointed another way. It's clever storytelling that makes us think we've figured things out, then pulls the rug out from under us. But what about Evil Morty? If he's not Rick C137's original Morty, then who is he? Where did he come from? Why does he specifically target Rick C137? The show finally answers these questions in Season 7. In the episode Unmortrican, we get a flashback showing Evil Morty's actual origin. The flashback shows Evil Morty with his Rick, who comes from dimension 79 equals greater than or equal to V. They're returning from an adventure that clearly went badly. Evil Morty looks frustrated and exhausted. His Rick is being his usual annoying self, acting superior and dismissive. Evil Morty tells his Rick that he's done. He doesn't want to go on adventures anymore. He's tired of being dragged around the universe, getting into danger, being treated like he doesn't matter. Rick laughs at this. Rick tells Evil Morty that if he wants to quit, he should quit. Rick says it mockingly, like he doesn't believe Morty has the courage to actually leave. Evil Morty doesn't argue. He just leaves the garage. But he doesn't actually quit. Instead, he waits until later that night. His Rick gets drunk, like Rick always does, and while his Rick is passed out drunk in the garage, Evil Morty comes back. He has his eye patch with him, the one with the mind control technology built into it. Evil Morty puts the eye patch on and activates it. He takes control of his Rick's brain, turning his grandfather into a puppet. That's Evil Morty's origin. He's not Rick C137's original Morty. He's just a regular Morty from a regular dimension who got sick of his Rick's abuse and manipulation. He's a Morty who was smart enough to figure out how to build mind control technology, and he's a Morty who was angry enough to actually use it. This origin is much simpler than the elaborate theory about him being Rick C137's first grandson. Evil Morty is from Dimension 79, not from C137. His Rick is Rick 79 implies subset of V, not Rick C137. He turned his own Rick into Evil Rick, the puppet Rick we saw in his first appearance. Then he started his plan to escape the central finite curve. But this still doesn't fully explain why Evil Morty specifically targeted Rick C137. If Evil Morty just wanted to download a Rick's brain for information about the Citadel and the curve, he could have used his own Rick. He had complete control over his Rick. He could have scanned his Rick's brain any time. The answer is that not all Ricks have the same knowledge. Most Ricks at the Citadel don't know the full truth about the central finite curve. They don't know how it was built or who built it. That information is secret, known only to the original Ricks who created the system. And Rick C137 was one of those original Ricks. Evil Morty somehow discovered that Rick C137 had this special knowledge. Maybe he investigated the Citadel's history and found records of who the founders were. Maybe his own Rick mentioned something about Rick C137 being different, being one of the original builders. However Evil Morty found out, he learned that Rick C137 specifically had the information he needed. So Evil Morty's plan wasn't personal revenge against Rick C137. It was practical. Rick C137 had knowledge that Evil Morty needed to escape. Evil Morty framed Rick C137 to lure him out. He scanned Rick C137's brain to get that knowledge. Then, he used that knowledge to become president and eventually break through the curve. Rick C137 was a target of opportunity, not a target of personal vendetta. This is the canonical truth that the show eventually revealed. Evil Morty isn't Rick C137's original Morty. Rick C137 never had an original Morty because his Beth died before she could have children. The photos and memories that seemed to prove otherwise were either misleading or showing something other than what we thought. And Evil Morty's focus on Rick C137 was about the information in Rick's brain, not about a personal history between them. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The theory was wrong. But interestingly, the theory being wrong actually makes the real story even darker and more disturbing than the theory was. Because if the theory had been true, at least Evil Morty's evil would have been Rick's fault in a direct way. At least there would have been a reason, a cause, a specific moment of betrayal that explained everything. But the truth is scarier than that. Section 12. Why the theory still matters. The theory was wrong. Evil Morty isn't Rick C137's original Morty. Rick C137 never had an original Morty to begin with. The photos, the memories, the timeline contradictions, all the evidence that seemed so convincing ended up pointing towards something different than what fans believed. We were wrong about Evil Morty's identity. We were wrong about Rick's path. We were wrong about almost everything the theory claimed. But here's the thing. The theory being false doesn't make it meaningless. In fact, the theory matters more now than it did when people believed it was true. Because the theory reveals what we wanted the story to be, and the gap between what we wanted and what we got shows us something important about Rick and Morty as a show. When fans built this theory, they were creating a story where Evil Morty's evil made sense, where there was a clear cause and effect. Rick abandoned his original Morty, or abused him, or lost him somehow. That specific betrayal turned a normal Morty into Evil Morty. It was tragic, but it was understandable. Rick created his own worst enemy through his terrible choices. Evil Morty's revenge was justified, at least from his perspective. The theory gave Evil Morty a motivation that felt human and relatable. But the real story doesn't work that way. Evil Morty's origin is much simpler, and somehow much worse. He's just a regular Morty who went on adventures with a regular Rick. His Rick wasn't specifically more abusive than other Ricks. His Rick didn't do something uniquely terrible that no other Rick would do. His Rick was just a normal Rick, which means his Rick treated him the way all Ricks treat their Mortys. With casual cruelty, manipulation, dismissiveness, and complete disregard for Morty's well-being. And that was enough. That normal level of Rick behavior was enough to turn Evil Morty into what he became. He didn't need some special trauma or specific betrayal. He just needed to experience what every Morty experiences, and he responded differently than most Mortys do. He got angry instead of staying scared. He got smart instead of staying dumb. He fought back instead of accepting his role. This is what Evil Morty means when he says that any Morty who's ever been sick of Rick has been an evil Morty. He's not saying all Mortys are secretly evil. He's saying that the label evil gets applied to any Morty who refuses to accept his place in the system. Any Morty who gets tired of being used. Any Morty who wants freedom from Rick's control. That's what makes a Morty evil, according to Rick's world. Not actual evil actions, but the desire to escape. Our Morty, Morty Prime, experiences the same things Evil Morty experienced. Rick drags him on dangerous adventures against his will. Rick insults him constantly. Rick erases his memories. Rick manipulates him. Rick puts him in life-threatening situations. Rick treats him as disposable camouflage rather than as a person. Everything Evil Morty went through, our Morty goes through too. The difference is that our Morty keeps forgiving Rick. He keeps coming back. He keeps choosing to stay. When Evil Morty offers him a chance to escape at the end of Rick Mirai Jack, Morty refuses. He chooses Rick over freedom. And the show never really explains why. It doesn't tell us that our Morty is smarter or more moral or somehow better than Evil Morty. It just shows us that our Morty makes a different choice. This makes Evil Morty more terrifying as a character, because he's not special. He's not uniquely damaged. He's just a Morty who decided he'd had enough. Which means any Morty could become Evil Morty. Our Morty could wake up tomorrow and decide he's done. He could build an eye patch and take control of Rick. He could murder hundreds of people to escape. He has every reason to do it, every justification. The only thing stopping him is that he chooses not to. The central finite curve adds another layer of darkness to all of this. Evil Morty discovered that every single universe accessible to Rick's is specifically a universe where Rick is the smartest person. Out of infinite possible universes, Ricks walled themselves off inside only the ones where they're guaranteed to be superior to everyone else. They couldn't handle the idea of universes where someone might be smarter than them, so they just blocked access to those universes entirely. This means every Morty who has ever existed across thousands of dimensions exists inside a cosmic prison specifically designed to keep Rick on top. Mortys are born into a multiverse artificially constructed to ensure Rick's superiority. They can't escape to a universe where Rick isn't the smartest. They can't find a reality where someone smarter than Rick could help them. They're trapped in Rick's ego, in Rick's need to feel special, in Rick's inability to accept that he might not be the most important person in existence. Evil Morty broke through that prison. He's the only being we know of who successfully escaped the central finite curve. He's living in the greater multiverse now, in universes where Ricks have no power, where Rick's intelligence isn't guaranteed to be supreme. He found actual freedom, and he did it by using the knowledge he stole from Rick C137's brain. turning Rick's own secrets against him. So what does all of this tell us about Rick C137 and his relationship with our Morty? If Rick never had an original Morty, if our Morty is just a random Morty from another dimension that Rick claimed, why does Rick care about him so much? Why is Rick willing to sacrifice himself for this Morty when other Ricks wouldn't? The answer is actually bleaker than the theory suggested. Rick's not overprotective because he lost a previous Morty and doesn't want to lose another one. Rick's not trying to make up for past mistakes. Rick just happened to attach to this particular Morty for reasons we don't fully understand. Maybe it's because Rick was living with this Morty's family while hunting for Rick Prime. Maybe being around a version of his dead daughter, even a fake version from another dimension, awakened something in Rick. Maybe Rick started to care, despite himself. Maybe Rick, who spent decades hunting for revenge, who gave up on connection and love, who became the most isolated and depressed person in the multiverse, found himself accidentally forming a bond with this random Morty. Not because this Morty is special, but because Rick was ready to feel something again, and this Morty happened to be there. That's not redemption. That's not Rick learning from past mistakes or trying to be better. That's just Rick randomly latching onto someone and deciding they matter, while still being the same terrible person who does terrible things. Rick cares about Morty, but he also abuses Morty. Rick would die for Morty, but he also erases Morty's memories when they're inconvenient. Rick's love doesn't make him good, it just makes him inconsistent and confusing. And this Morty is stuck with it. Not his original grandfather, but a replacement grandfather from another dimension. A Rick who showed up claiming to be family, but is actually a stranger. A Rick who sometimes treats him with genuine affection, and sometimes treats him like garbage. A Rick whose mood changes based on factors Morty can't predict or control. Morty has every reason to turn into Evil Morty. He has every reason to build that eye patch and take control. But he doesn't. And we don't know if that makes him strong or if it makes him broken. We don't know if Morty's loyalty is admirable or if it's just proof that Rick's manipulation worked. We don't know if Morty staying is a choice or if it's conditioning. The show doesn't give us clear answers about whether our Morty is better than Evil Morty or if he's just more damaged. The theory about Evil Morty being Rick's original Morty was comforting in a weird way. It gave Evil Morty's actions a clear motivation. It made Rick's behavior toward our Morty make sense as overcompensation. It suggested that Rick could learn, could change, could avoid repeating his mistakes. The theory implied growth and cause and effect and a universe where actions have logical consequences. But the real story denies us that comfort. Evil Morty is evil just because he refused to keep being a victim. Rick cares about our Morty for no particular reason other than he happens to care. The multiverse is a prison built by narcissists who couldn't handle not being the smartest. Mortys exist to suffer so Ricks can feel important. There's no grand plan, no lesson learned, no redemption arc. There's just an endless cycle of Ricks using Mortys, and occasionally a Morty gets sick enough of it to become, quote, evil. The photos and memories that started this whole theory still exist in the show. They still don't make sense with the timeline. The show never explained them after revealing Rick's real backstory. They're just hanging there, mysteries that might not have answers. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the show wants us to know that not everything gets explained. Not everything has a reason. Sometimes there's just evidence that points toward a story that turns out to be completely wrong. Thousands of fans spent years believing Evil Morty was Rick's original Morty. They analyzed every episode, every line of dialogue, every background detail. They built a comprehensive theory that explained everything perfectly. And they were wrong. But their theory revealed something true about what we want from stories. We want trauma to have clear causes. We want evil to have origins we can understand. We want the universe to make sense. Rick and Morty refuses to give us that. The show presents a universe where terrible things happen for no good reason, where people suffer not because of dramatic betrayals, but because of casual, everyday cruelty, where the smartest person alive uses his intelligence to build a prison for everyone else, where a 14-year-old kid becoming a mass murderer is just the logical result of the system working as designed. Evil Morty isn't special. He's not Rick's original Morty. He's not from C137. He's not the result of one specific trauma. He's just a Morty, any Morty, every Morty who ever gets sick of Rick. And that's so much worse than if the theory had been true, because it means the problem isn't one bad Rick who made one specific mistake. The problem is, every Rick, every dimension, every relationship between Ricks and Mortys across the entire central finite curve. The theory was wrong, but it still matters. It matters because it shows us what we hoped the story would be, and by seeing what we hoped for, we can better understand what the story actually is. The story is darker, bleaker, more hopeless than we wanted. But it's also more honest about how abuse works, how systems of control work, how seemingly ordinary situations can create monsters. And somewhere out there, beyond the central finite curve, Evil Morty is free. He escaped. He won. He did what every other Morty dreams of doing. And if he could do it, maybe others could too. Maybe our Morty could, if he ever wanted to. The fact that he doesn't want to, or at least hasn't wanted to yet, is its own kind of tragedy. Conclusion. So did Evil Morty turn out to be Rick's original Morty? No. The theory was completely wrong. Rick C137 never had an original Morty because his Beth died as a child. Evil Morty is just a regular Morty from Dimension 79, implies subset of V, who got tired of his Rick's abuse and fought back. The elaborate backstory fans constructed, the personal vendetta, the tragic origin of abandonment and betrayal, none of it was real. But looking back at everything we explored, the theory being false doesn't make it pointless. We had real evidence. The timeline contradiction was genuine. Rick couldn't have been around baby Morty if he was gone for 20 years, and Morty is only 14. The photos at Bird Person's house actually exist in the show. The memories of baby Morty really appeared during Rick's brain scan. Evil Morty genuinely did target Rick C137 specifically, hack his portal gun, and download his brain for information about the central finite curve. All of that evidence pointed us toward a story about a Rick who lost his first Morty and was trying desperately not to lose his second one. We saw Rick's unusual emotional attachment, his warnings about cocky Mortys being dangerous, his willingness to sacrifice himself. We saw Evil Morty's genius-level intelligence, his intimate knowledge of Rick C137's secrets, his laser focus on this one specific Rick out of infinite options. We connected the dots and built a theory that made perfect sense. The show deliberately gave us those dots to connect. The writers included the photos knowing they contradicted the timeline. They showed us Rick's memories knowing we'd ask questions. They had Evil Morty specifically target Rick C137, knowing we'd assume it was personal. They planted evidence and let us build theories for years before revealing the truth. That's not accidental. That's storytelling designed to make us think we figured something out, only to show us we were looking at it all wrong. And what we were wrong about reveals something important. We wanted Evil Morty's evil to have a specific cause, a dramatic origin, a Rick who did something uniquely terrible. But the real answer is so much darker. Evil Morty is just a normal Morty who experienced normal Rick behavior and decided he'd had enough. He's not special, he's not uniquely traumatized, he's just a Morty who refused to keep being a victim. That means any Morty could become Evil Morty. Our Morty could wake up tomorrow and make the same choice. Every Morty across infinite dimensions has the same justification, the same reasons, the same potential. They're all trapped inside the central finite curve, a cosmic prison built by Ricks who couldn't handle universes where they weren't the smartest. They all suffer the casual cruelty of Ricks who see them as tools rather than people. The theory wanted Rick and Morty's story to be about redemption and learning from mistakes. But the show is actually about cycles of abuse that repeat across infinite dimensions, because that's what the system was designed to do. Evil Morty escaped that system, and his freedom is the only real victory anyone achieves. Everyone else is still trapped, still suffering, still playing their assigned roles in Rick's infinite crib. We were wrong about Evil Morty, but we were right that something is deeply, terribly broken about this universe. And that might be the most important truth of all. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.